I never used to believe the stories people told about the deep woods. I figured they were just campfire tales, meant to spook hikers into sticking to the trails and respecting nature. But after what I saw, what I lived through, I know better now. Some places are just not meant to be disturbed, and some things that lurk in the dark should never be found. My first week as a park ranger had been uneventful. I spent most of my time checking trail markers, ensuring campers had the right permits, and occasionally warning tourists about local wildlife. The usual stuff. But on my 7th night, I was assigned to the Fire Watch Tower, a lonely structure perched on the edge of the densest part of the forest. It was my job to monitor the area, keep an eye out for any signs of wildfires, and report anything unusual. Simple enough, or so I thought. At first, the night was peaceful. The wind whispered through the trees, and the stars glowed faintly in the black sky. I leaned against the railing, breathing in the cool night air, when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a low, guttural growl, deep in the trees below. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness. I expected to see a bear, maybe a mountain lion, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of trees, swaying slightly in the breeze. I shook it off, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then the radio crackled. It was supposed to be a closed channel, only used by the other rangers, but the voice that came through was not one I recognized. It was distant, garbled, almost human, but distorted, like someone speaking underwater. I couldn't make out the words, just the rhythm of speech. "Hello, this is Ranger Holt. Who's on this channel?" Static answered. Then laughter. Hollow, breathless laughter that sent a chill down my spine. I switched the radio off, my hands trembling. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Maybe my radio was malfunctioning. But deep down, I knew it was neither. As the night dragged on, I felt an unease settle over me. The forest, once so alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, had gone unnervingly silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then I saw the movement. At the tree line, just at the edge of the tower spotlight, something shifted. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But then I saw it again, a figure, impossibly tall and thin, moving between the trees with an unnatural grace. My breath hitched as I tried to focus my beam on it, but it vanished before the light could touch it. A sharp knock at the door nearly made me jump out of my skin. I spun around, my heart hammering. I was alone. The tower was locked. No one should have been able to climb up without me hearing them. I swallowed hard and slowly approached the door. "Who's there?" Silence. My fingers hovered over the handle. Then another knock. Louder this time. More insistent. My gut screamed at me not to open it, but I couldn't just ignore it either. I reached for my sidearm and yanked the door open. Nothing. The wooden platform outside was empty. But as I stepped out, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like I had walked into a place I wasn't supposed to be. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. That's when I heard it. A whisper, right in my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I bolted back inside and slammed the door shut, locking it tight. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. But then, the knocking started again. Not on the door this time. On the windows. All of them. A rhythmic, deliberate tapping, like fingers drumming against the glass. I pressed my back against the wall, my eyes darting between the windows. Shadows moved outside, circling the tower. The tapping grew more frantic. Then it stopped. The silence was even worse. The radio crackled back to life. This time, I could make out the words. "Let us in." The voice was wrong. It was layered, as if more than one person was speaking in unison. I turned off the radio, but the voice continued, whispering from the very walls of the tower. "We see you. We know you. We remember." I don't know how long I sat there, gripping my gun, waiting for dawn, but when the first light of morning crept over the treetops, the whispers faded. The knocking stopped. I dared to look outside. Nothing. The forest was as it had always been, peaceful, undisturbed. But I knew better. I knew something had been there. Something had watched me. I reported the incident. but my supervisor just gave me a knowing look and told me to get some rest. He didn't question me. He didn't even seem surprised. That was when I realized I wasn't the first ranger to encounter whatever lurked in those woods, and I wouldn't be the last. I tried to go back to normal, to convince myself that it was a one-time thing, but the forest wouldn't let me. Over the next few weeks, I heard my own voice calling from the trees, even when I hadn't spoken. I saw shadows moving where there shouldn't be any, and at night, I dreamed of a place beneath the roots, a hollow space filled with pale figures that watched and whispered and waited. I left the job after 3 months. I never gave a reason. I just packed up and disappeared. But even now, years later, I still hear them sometimes. In the quiet moments between sleep and wakefulness, the knocking, the whispers, and the laughter, hollow and breathless, calling me back to the forest. I thought leaving the park would be enough, that once I got away, once I put miles between myself and that cursed forest, the whispers would stop, that the knocking would fade into memory, and I could convince myself it was all a bad dream. But you can't run from something that's inside you. You can't escape something that knows your name. I moved to a small town 3 states away, took a job at a hardware store, and tried to build a normal life. But normal had become a foreign concept to me. At night, I would wake up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window, always in that same rhythmic pattern. At first, I told myself it was just tree branches, wind, my overactive imagination. But then I started seeing them again, shadows in the corner of my vision, figures too tall, too thin, standing just beyond the streetlights. I stopped looking out my windows after dark. The dreams were the worst part. Every night, I was back in a fire tower, trapped in the darkness as the voices surrounded me. They whispered secrets in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow I felt their meaning. They were waiting. They were patient. They were calling me back. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I swore I could still hear them, lingering in the quiet hum of my apartment. It all came to a head one night when I woke up not in my bed, but standing at my front door, my hand on the lock. The whispers filled my ears, urging me to open it. My fingers twitched, and for a terrifying moment, I almost did. But some primal instinct, some last shred of my own will, forced me to pull back. I turned on every light in my apartment and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found something outside my door. A single handprint pressed into the wood, smeared like someone had dragged their fingers through ash. I packed my bags that same day. I spent the next few weeks driving with no real destination, stopping only when exhaustion made it impossible to continue. Every motel I stayed at, I triple-locked the doors, shoved furniture against them, and kept my gun within reach. But it didn't matter. They always found me. The whispers crawled through the vents, the knocking echoed from the walls, and the laughter, God, the laughter, followed me wherever I went. Then one night I saw him. I had stopped at a rundown diner just off the highway, hoping a meal would settle my nerves. The place was nearly empty, just a bored waitress behind the counter and an old man nursing a cup of coffee in the corner. I kept my head down, ate quickly, and paid my bill. But as I turned to leave, I caught sight of something through the window. A man stood across the street, just barely visible in the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. He was wearing a park ranger uniform, my uniform, but the face beneath the hat was my own. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. The doppelganger tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. Then, it lifted one hand and beckoned. I bolted. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped them. When I finally got the door open, I locked it, started the engine, and tore out of there, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was hundreds of miles away. I knew then that running was pointless. Whatever this was, it wasn't bound to the forest. It had latched onto me, sunk its claws into my soul, and it wasn't going to let go. I had only one option left. I had to go back. The decision settled over me like a weight, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. I had been avoiding it, pretending I could outrun something that had already claimed me. But I knew the truth now. The only way to end this was to return to where it began, The drive back to the park was a blur. Every mile closer made my skin crawl, my mind scream in protest, but I forced myself to keep going. By the time I reached the entrance, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The sight of the familiar wooden sign sent a shiver down my spine. The place looked the same, but I could feel the difference. The air was heavier, charged with something unnatural. The forest was waiting for me. I parked near the old ranger station, grabbing my flashlight and gun before heading toward the fire tower. With each step, memories came rushing back. The knocking, the whispers, the laughter, the shadows in the trees. When I reached the base of the tower, I hesitated. The door was ajar. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly pushed it open and stepped inside. The wooden steps creaked beneath my weight as I climbed, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. The room at the top was just as I had left it, the chair still knocked over, the radio sitting silently on the desk. But there was something new. In the center of the floor, etched into the wood, was a symbol, a twisted, intricate design that seemed to shift when I looked at it. My pulse pounded in my ears. A voice, soft and familiar, whispered behind me, "You came back." I turned slowly. There he was, my reflection, my twin, the thing that had been following me, haunting me. He stood in the doorway, watching me with dark, hollow eyes. "What do you want?" My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. His lips curled into a smile. "You know what we want." The shadows around him twisted, stretching unnaturally across the floor. The air grew thick, suffocating. My knees went weak. "You belong here." I shook my head, stepping back, but there was nowhere to go. The room felt smaller, closing in around me. The whispers grew louder, overlapping. A chorus of voices speaking in tongues. The first time I saw the forest, I knew it was alive. Not in the way trees sway or birds sing, but in a way that made my skin crawl, as if the very air was watching me. It was late autumn, and the leaves had turned a deep, bloody red, clinging stubbornly to the branches despite the cold wind that whispered through the woods. I shouldn't have been there. No one went into the Black Hollow Forest after dark, not even the hunters. But I had no choice. My sister, Lila, had vanished 2 nights ago, and the last place anyone had seen her was near the edge of these woods. The townsfolk said she'd been lured in by the forest demon. They said it was too late to save her, but I couldn't accept that, not without seeing for myself. The path into the forest was narrow, barely visible beneath the thick undergrowth. My boots crunched on the frost-covered leaves, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches twisting together like skeletal fingers, blocking out the moonlight. I carried a lantern, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the ground. Every few steps, I'd stop and call out Lila's name, my voice echoing eerily through the trees. There was no answer, just the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I told myself it was just animals, but the deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being followed. I don't know how long I walked before I found the first sign of her. It was a scrap of fabric, torn from the hem of her dress, caught on a thorny bush. My heart raced as I held it up to the lantern light. The fabric was damp, as if it had been lying there for days, but I knew it hadn't been. Lila had been wearing this dress when she disappeared. I pressed on, my pace quickening, the lantern swinging wildly in my hand. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing denser, the shadows darker. And then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, flickering like a will-o'-the-wisp. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't, not when Lila might be out there, waiting for me. As I approached the light, I realized it was coming from a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its trunk twisted and scarred, its branches reaching out like claws. Hanging from one of the branches was a lantern, identical to the one I carried, its flame burning a sickly green. Beneath the tree was a circle of stones, arranged in a pattern that made my head ache just to look at them. And in the middle of that circle was Lila. She was kneeling, her back to me, her head bowed as if in prayer. Relief flooded through me, and I started to call out to her, but the words died in my throat. Something was wrong. Her shoulders were shaking, but not from crying. She was laughing, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "Lila," I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I took a step closer, the lantern light flickering as my hand shook. "Lila, it's me. I'm here to take you home." Still, she didn't move. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but before I could, she turned her head. My breath caught in my throat. Her eyes were black, completely devoid of any color, and her smile was too wide, stretching across her face in a way that was utterly inhuman. She opened her mouth to speak, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was deep, guttural, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. And then the ground beneath me gave way. I woke up in darkness, my head pounding and my body aching. The lantern was gone, and I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I tried to sit up, but something was holding me down, thick. Rope-like vines wrapped around my arms and legs. Panic surged through me as I struggled against them, but the more I moved, the tighter they became. And then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart raced as I strained to see through the darkness. Slowly, shapes began to emerge, the walls of what looked like a cavern, covered in moss and glowing fungi, the vines that bound me, pulsing faintly as if they were alive. And in the shadows, something moved. It stepped into the dim light, and I wished it hadn't. The creature was tall, its body covered in bark-like skin that cracked and oozed a dark, sticky sap. Its limbs were long and twisted, ending in clawed hands that scraped against the stone floor. Its face was the worst part, a grotesque mask of wood and bone, with hollow eyes that glowed like embers, and a mouth filled with jagged, splintered teeth. It tilted its head as it looked at me, and I could feel its gaze like a physical weight, pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. "You are brave," it said, its voice like the creaking of ancient trees. "Or foolish. Few dare to enter my domain." I tried to speak, to beg for my life, but the words caught in my throat. The creature leaned closer, its breath hot and foul, like rotting leaves. "Your sister made a bargain with me. She offered herself in exchange for the life of another. But you are different. You came here willingly. That makes you far more interesting." I didn't understand what it was saying, but I knew one thing. I had to get out of there. I twisted and pulled at the vines, ignoring the pain as they cut into my skin. The creature watched me, its head tilted as if amused by my struggle. And then it reached out, its clawed hand brushing against my cheek. I froze, my breath hitching as its touch sent a wave of cold through me. "Do not fear," it said. "I do not wish to harm you. Not yet. You have something I want. Something your sister could not give me." "What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature smiled, its jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. "Your soul," it said, "but not in the way you think. I do not wish to consume it. I wish to merge with it, to become one with you. Together, we could be powerful, unstoppable." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No, please. I just want to save my sister. Let us go." The creature straightened, its expression unreadable. "Very well," it said. "I will give you a chance. A test, if you will. If you succeed, I will release your sister. But if you fail—" It didn't need to finish the sentence. I already knew what would happen. The vines around me loosened, and I fell to the ground, gasping for air. The creature stepped back, gesturing to a narrow tunnel that led deeper into the cavern. "Go," it said. "Find the heart of the forest. Bring it to me, and your sister will be free." I didn't know what the heart of the forest was, or how I was supposed to find it, but I didn't have a choice. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me, and started down the tunnel. The walls were damp and covered in strange, glowing symbols that pulsed faintly as I passed. The air grew colder the further I went, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew one thing. I couldn't fail. Not if it meant losing Lila forever. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. I lost track of time, my mind numb with fear and exhaustion. And then, finally, I saw light ahead. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding as I emerged into another cavern. This one was different, brighter, with a soft, golden light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. In the center of the cavern was a tree, but unlike any tree I had ever seen. Its trunk was smooth and silver, its branches reaching up to the ceiling, where they disappeared into the rock, and hanging from one of the branches was a single, glowing fruit, pulsing with a light that seemed to call to me. I knew, without a doubt, that this was the heart of the forest, but as I reached out to take it, I heard a voice behind me. "Don't." I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. It was Lila. She looked like herself again, her eyes clear and her face pale but human. She was standing at the edge of the cavern, her hands outstretched as if to stop me. "Don't take it," she said, her voice trembling. "If you do, you'll be trapped here forever, just like me." I stared at her, my mind racing. But the demon said if I brought it the heart, it would let you go. Lila shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It lied. It always lies. Please, you have to leave. Now, before it's too late." I hesitated, torn between the desire to save her and the fear of what might happen if I stayed. And then I heard it, the low, rumbling growl of the forest demon, coming from the tunnel behind me. It was coming, and I had to make a choice. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the cavern like thunder, and I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I stood frozen between Lila and the glowing fruit. Her eyes pleaded with me, wide and desperate, but the demon's presence loomed behind me, its malevolent energy pressing against my back like a physical force. I could feel its breath, hot and rancid, as it drew closer, and I knew I had only seconds to decide. "Take it," Lila suddenly screamed, her voice breaking with urgency. "Take it and run. Don't let it get you." Her words clashed with her earlier warning, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by confusion. Was she trying to save me or trap me? The demon's laughter filled the cavern, a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "She lies," it hissed, its voice slithering into my mind. "She fears what you will become. Take the heart, and you will have power beyond your wildest dreams. You will never be weak again." I turned back to the fruit, its golden light pulsing like a heartbeat. It was mesmerizing, beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and as they brushed against its smooth surface, a surge of energy shot through me. It was warm and electric, filling me with a sense of strength I had never known. But beneath that warmth was something darker, something cold and hungry, and it whispered to me, promising things I couldn't quite understand. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the fruit, and in that moment, Lila lunged forward, grabbing my arm. "No," she cried, her grip like iron. "You don't understand what it will do to you. It's not just a fruit, it's a prison. If you take it, you'll be bound to this forest forever, just like me, just like all the others." Her words hit me like a blow, and I stumbled back, my hand falling away from the fruit. The demon roared in fury, its voice shaking the cavern, and I turned to see it emerging from the tunnel, its grotesque form illuminated by the golden light. Its eyes burned with rage, and its claws scraped against the stone floor as it advanced toward us. Lila pulled me behind her, her body trembling but resolute. "Run," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the demon's growls. "I'll hold it off. Just run and don't look back." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I can't leave you," I said, my voice breaking. "Not again." She turned to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "You have to," she said. "This is my punishment, not yours. I made a bargain, and now I have to pay the price. But you still have a chance." Before I could argue, she shoved me toward the tunnel, her strength surprising me. I stumbled, catching myself against the wall, and when I turned back, she was facing the demon, her arms spread wide as if to shield me. The creature loomed over her, its jagged teeth bared, and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't leave her. Not like this. I glanced at the fruit, its light still pulsing, and an idea began to form in my mind. It was reckless, maybe even suicidal, but it was the only chance I had. I lunged for the fruit, my fingers closing around it just as the demon let out a deafening roar. The moment I touched it, the energy surged through me again, stronger this time, and I felt my body being pulled in two directions at once. The warmth filled me, but the coldness was there too, clawing at the edges of my mind, trying to take control. I fought against it, focusing on Lila, on the thought of saving her, and I felt the energy shift, responding to my will. The cavern began to tremble, the walls cracking as the light from the fruit grew brighter, and I realized with a mix of awe and terror that I was holding the heart of the forest, the source of its power. The demon turned to me, its eyes wide with shock and fury. "What have you done?" it snarled, its voice shaking with rage. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The energy was too much, too overwhelming, and I felt myself losing control. The coldness was spreading, seeping into my thoughts, and I knew I didn't have much time. I focused on Lila, on the image of her safe and free, and I poured all of my will into the fruit. The light exploded, blinding me, and I felt myself being lifted off the ground, the energy surging through me like a tidal wave. When the light faded, I was on my knees, the fruit still clutched in my hand. The cavern was silent, the air thick with tension, and I looked up to see the demon standing frozen, its body encased in a shell of glowing bark. Lila was beside me, her face pale but unharmed, and she stared at the demon with a mixture of fear and relief. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, my own voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," I said, "but I think it's trapped." The demon's eyes burned with hatred, but it couldn't move, couldn't speak. The bark encasing it pulsed faintly, as if it were alive, and I realized with a start that the energy from the fruit was still flowing through me, connecting me to the demon, to the forest. I could feel it, the ancient, malevolent presence that had haunted these woods for centuries, and I knew that I had bound myself to it. The coldness in my mind grew stronger, and I felt a surge of panic. What had I done? Lila grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. "We have to go," she said, her voice urgent, "before it breaks free." I nodded, my legs shaking as I stood, and together we stumbled toward the tunnel. The energy from the fruit was fading, but the connection remained, a faint hum in the back of my mind. I could still feel the forest, its ancient power, its hunger, and I knew that this wasn't over. The demon was trapped, but it wasn't defeated, and neither was I. We emerged from the tunnel into the clearing, the ancient oak tree looming over us like a silent sentinel. The lantern still hung from its branch, its green flame flickering faintly, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The forest was quiet, the air still, but I could feel it watching us, waiting. Lila pulled me toward the path, her grip tight, and I followed, my mind racing. What had I done? What had I become? The questions swirled in my head, but there was no time to answer them. We had to get out of the forest. We had to get home. The path seemed longer than before, the trees closing in around us as we ran. The shadows shifted, twisting and writhing like living things, and I could feel the forest's anger, its frustration, as we moved further away from its heart. The connection in my mind grew fainter, but it didn't disappear, and I knew that it never would. I had bound myself to the forest, to the demon, and there was no escaping it. Not now, not ever. When we finally reached the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The trees thinned, the shadows receded, and we stumbled into the open field, gasping for breath. Lila collapsed to her knees, her body shaking with sobs, and I sank down beside her, my own legs giving out. We were free, for now, but I knew that the forest wasn't done with us. It would call to me, whisper to me in my dreams, and one day, I would have to answer. I looked down at my hand, the one that had held the fruit, and saw that the skin was marked with faint, glowing lines, like veins of gold. They pulsed faintly, in time with the hum in my mind, and I knew that they would never fade. I had taken the heart of the forest, and in doing so, I had become a part of it. The demon was trapped, but it wasn't gone, and neither was I. Lila looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, and I could see the fear in them, not just for herself, but for me. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, my own voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, "but whatever happens, we'll face it together." She nodded, her grip on my hand tightening, and we sat there in the dawn light, the forest looming behind us, waiting. The demon was silent, but I could feel its presence, cold and hungry, in the back of my mind, and I knew that this was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and unease. Lila and I returned to the village, but the relief I had hoped to feel never came. The villagers stared at us as we passed, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. They had heard the stories, the whispers of the forest demon and the cursed heart, and they knew something had changed. I could see it in their faces, in the way they avoided my gaze and crossed the street when I approached. Even the children, who had once run to greet me, now hid behind their mother's skirts, their eyes wide with fear. I wanted to tell them that I was still the same person, that I had only done what I had to do to save my sister, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain something I didn't even understand myself? Lila stayed close to me, her presence a constant comfort, but even she seemed different. She was quieter, more withdrawn, and I often caught her staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear exactly, but something deeper, something that made my chest ache. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but I was afraid of the answer, afraid that she would tell me I had changed, that I wasn't the same person who had gone into the forest to save her. And maybe she would have been right. The golden lines on my hand had spread, creeping up my arm like vines, and the hum in my mind had grown louder, more insistent. I could feel the forest calling to me, its voice a low, persistent whisper that I couldn't ignore. It wanted me to return, to take my place as its new heart, and the thought filled me with a mixture of dread and longing. The nights were the worst. When I closed my eyes, I saw the forest, its twisted trees and glowing symbols, and I felt the demon's presence, cold and hungry, in the back of my mind. It spoke to me in my dreams, its voice a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. "You cannot escape me," it said. "You are mine now, bound to me by the heart you took. You will return, and when you do, I will be waiting." I would wake up gasping, my body drenched in sweat, and Lila would be there, her hand on my shoulder, her eyes filled with worry. "It's just a dream," she would say, but we both knew it wasn't. The forest was calling to me, and it wouldn't stop until I answered. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers had grown too loud, too insistent, and I felt like I was being pulled in two directions at once. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lila, and made my way to the edge of the village. The forest loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette outlined against the moonlit sky, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't want to go back, but I knew I had to. The connection between me and the forest was too strong, too deep, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest, and stepped onto the path. The forest was different this time. The trees seemed taller, their branches reaching out like claws, and the air was thick with a strange, electric energy. The golden lines on my arm pulsed faintly, their light casting an eerie glow on the ground, and I could feel the forest's presence all around me, watching, waiting. I followed the path, my steps slow and hesitant, and as I walked, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just in my mind anymore, they were all around me, filling the air with a low, guttural hum that made my skin crawl. I wanted to turn back, to run as far away as I could, but I knew it was too late. The forest had claimed me, and there was no escaping it. I reached the clearing, the ancient oak tree looming over me like a silent sentinel, and I felt a surge of panic. The lantern still hung from its branch, its green flame flickering faintly, and the circle of stones was still there, arranged in the same pattern that had made my head ache before. But something was different. The air was thicker, heavier, and I could feel the demon's presence, cold and hungry, in the back of my mind. It was waiting for me, and I knew I had no choice but to face it. I stepped into the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest, and the moment I did, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The trees swayed, their branches creaking and groaning, and the air was filled with a low, rumbling growl that made my skin crawl. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, and saw the demon emerging from the shadows. Its body was still encased in the shell of glowing bark, but its eyes burned with a fierce, malevolent light, and I could feel its rage, its hunger, as it advanced toward me. "You came back," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl that made my chest ache. "I knew you would. You cannot resist the call of the forest. You are mine now, bound to me by the heart you took." I shook my head, my voice trembling. "I'm not yours," I said. "I came back to end this, to free myself from you." The demon laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "You cannot free yourself," it said. "You are a part of me now, just as I am a part of you. The heart you took has bound us together, and there is no escaping it." I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out. The golden lines on my arm pulsed faintly, their light growing brighter, and I realized with a start that the energy from the fruit was still inside me, connecting me to the forest, to the demon. I focused on it, on the warmth and the coldness, and I felt it shift, responding to my will. The ground beneath me began to tremble, the trees swaying as the energy surged through me, and I knew I had to act fast. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the demon's chest. The moment I did, the energy exploded, a blinding light, filling the clearing as the connection between us surged. I felt the demon's presence, cold and hungry, in the back of my mind, and I focused all of my will on pushing it out, on breaking the bond that held us together. The demon roared in fury, its body writhing as the energy tore through it, and I felt a surge of pain as the connection between us was severed. When the light faded, I was on my knees, my body trembling with exhaustion. The demon was gone, its body reduced to a pile of ash, and the forest was silent, the air thick with tension. I looked down at my hand, the golden lines still pulsing faintly, and I felt a surge of relief. The demon was gone, but the connection to the forest remained, a faint hum in the back of my mind. I knew it wasn't over, that the forest would always be a part of me. But for now, I was free. I stood, my legs shaking beneath me, and made my way back to the village. The sun was rising, its light casting a warm glow over the trees, and I felt a surge of hope. The demon was gone, but the forest was still alive, its presence a faint hum in the back of my mind. I knew it would always be a part of me, but I also knew that I had the strength to face it. I had taken the heart of the forest, and in doing so, I had become something more, something stronger. When I reached the village, Lila was waiting for me, her eyes filled with worry. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head, my own voice barely a whisper. "I had to go back," I said. "I had to face it." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief, and I knew that she understood. The forest was a part of me now, and it always would be. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had faced the demon, and I had won. And whatever came next, I knew I could face it. Together. Story 2. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness as I stepped onto the forest path, my boots crunching against the carpet of dried leaves. I had always heard the whispered tales about the woods, stories passed down by the locals about a presence that lurked within. The older residents, the ones with weathered faces and eyes that had seen too much, would speak of strange occurrences, disappearances, eerie sounds, and shadows that moved against the natural rhythm of the trees. I had always dismissed them as folklore, remnants of a time when imagination ran wild. But standing there now, with the dense canopy overhead and the encroaching shadows swallowing the last light of day, I wasn't so sure anymore. The forest seemed alive in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The trees, gnarled and ancient, twisted their branches skyward like skeletal fingers, clawing at the heavens. Moss clung to their trunks, and the air was ripe with the scent of decay and earth, as though the ground itself was exhaling centuries of secrets. Every step I took felt invasive, a trespass into a realm that wasn't meant for me. The deeper I ventured, the more the world outside seemed to fade away, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears. Even the birds, which had been chirping incessantly earlier, were conspicuously absent. It was as though the forest had swallowed their song, leaving only an emptiness that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I told myself I was imagining things. It was just a forest, after all, an ancient, overgrown expanse of land that had been here long before me and would remain long after. Yet, as I continued forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin prickled, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, defying the logical patterns cast by my flashlight. It was as if the darkness had a will of its own, slithering and curling around the edges of my vision, daring me to look closer. The first sign that something was truly wrong came in the form of a sound, a low, guttural groan that resonated through the trees, like the growl of some unseen beast. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs as I scanned the underbrush for any sign of movement. The sound came again, closer this time, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't the growl of an animal. It was something deeper, more primal, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of my bones. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, its feeble beam slicing through the darkness, but offering little comfort. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, or perhaps the groaning of the ancient trees as they settled under their own weight. But when I noticed the way the leaves beneath my feet seemed to pulse, as though the forest floor itself was alive and breathing, I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble ever so slightly, and I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. I wanted to turn back, to retrace my steps and leave this cursed place behind, but the path I had taken seemed to twist and vanish into the shadows. I could no longer tell which way led back to safety. Panic began to creep in, its icy tendrils wrapping around my thoughts and squeezing until rationality gave way to instinct. I started to move faster, my boots scuffing against the uneven terrain as I searched for any sign of an exit. The trees loomed closer, their branches intertwining above me to form a nearly impenetrable barrier. The air grew colder with each step, and my breath came in ragged puffs that hung in the air like ghostly remnants. I stumbled upon a clearing, and for a brief moment I felt a flicker of hope, but the sight that greeted me extinguished that hope in an instant. In the center of the clearing stood an enormous tree, its trunk blackened and twisted as though it had been scorched by some ancient fire. Its branches stretched outward like the arms of some grotesque creature, and its bark was covered in deep, jagged grooves that resembled claw marks. At its base, the earth was disturbingly bare, as though nothing dared to grow in its shadow. I approached it cautiously, unable to tear my gaze away despite the primal part of me screaming to run. As I drew closer, I noticed something carved into the tree's bark, symbols that I didn't recognize, etched deep and oozing a dark, tar-like substance. The groaning sound came again, this time emanating from the tree itself, and I realized with horror that the grooves in its bark were shifting, rearranging themselves into a nightmarish face. Its hollow eye seemed to follow me, and its twisted mouth opened wide in a silent scream. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the ground. In the faint glow of its beam, I saw movement, shadows spilling forth from the tree like ink, coalescing into a form that defied logic or reason. It stood tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways that no creature should. Its body was a writhing mass of shadow and smoke, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent light that pierced through the darkness. It didn't move toward me, not at first. It simply stood there, watching, as though it were savoring the fear that radiated from me in waves. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there paralyzed by its gaze, but my body refused to obey. When it finally moved, it was almost too fast to comprehend. One moment it was standing by the tree, and the next it was mere inches from me, its shadowy form enveloping me in an icy embrace. The world seemed to tilt, the ground falling away beneath my feet as I was plunged into a suffocating darkness. My mind reeled as I tried to make sense of what was happening, but the more I struggled, the deeper I seemed to sink. Whispers filled my ears, incoherent at first, but growing louder and more distinct with each passing second. They spoke of things I couldn't understand, ancient and terrible truths that threatened to unravel my sanity. When I finally awoke, I was lying on the forest floor, the morning light filtering through the trees, and illuminating the dew-covered leaves around me. The clearing was gone, as was the cursed tree and the shadowy creature that had emerged from it. But the symbols were still burned into my mind, and my body ached as though I had been dragged through the very depths of hell. I staggered to my feet, every muscle protesting as I tried to orient myself. The forest seemed different now, less menacing but no less alive. It watched me with a quiet intensity, as though it were waiting for something. I don't know how I found my way out, but when I finally emerged from the forest, I felt as though I had left a part of myself behind. The whispers still lingered at the edges of my consciousness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with me yet. As I stumbled back to the safety of my home, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the creature watching me from the shadows. It didn't appear, but the unease remained, gnawing at me like a persistent itch. Now, as I sit here trying to piece together the fragments of that night, I can't help but wonder if I've escaped at all. The forest has a way of calling to you, of drawing you back into its depths, no matter how hard you try to resist. I know I should stay away, that going back would mean tempting fate, but there's a part of me that can't let go. The symbols, the whispers, the shadowy presence, all of it feels like an unfinished story, one that I'm destined to see through to the end. And so, I find myself staring out the window, the edge of the forest looming in the distance, wondering if I'll have the courage, or the foolishness, to answer its call again. The days that followed my escape from the forest were a haze of unease and restless nights. Sleep, when it came, was fragmented and haunted by vivid dreams that dissolved into ungraspable shadows the moment I opened my eyes. The whispers that had once lingered at the edge of my mind now burrowed deeper, threading through my thoughts with a persistence that made it impossible to ignore them. They were not words exactly, but fragments of emotions, impressions, and fleeting glimpses of something ancient and unfathomable. At times, I would catch myself mumbling under my breath, trying to piece together their elusive meaning, only to stop short when I realized what I was doing. It was as though the forest had left a mark on me, an invisible tether that refused to let me go. I avoided looking at the forest whenever possible, though its presence was impossible to ignore. It loomed at the edge of my vision, a constant reminder of the night that had changed everything. The townspeople went about their lives as though nothing was amiss, their laughter and mundane chatter a jarring contrast to the weight that pressed against my chest. I envied their ignorance, their ability to see the forest as nothing more than a collection of trees and shadows. For them, it was a boundary, a place to be respected but not feared. For me, it had become something else entirely, a malevolent entity that watched and waited. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast the world in hues of amber and crimson, I found myself standing at my window, staring out at the darkening line of trees. The whispers had grown louder, their cadence shifting from disjointed murmurs to something almost melodic. It was not a pleasant melody, but one that unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I pressed my palms against the glass, the cool surface grounding me as I tried to resist the pull that seemed to emanate from the forest. The logical part of me knew I should stay away, but there was a deeper, more primal part that yearned to return, to confront whatever it was that had marked me. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers became impossible to ignore. They bled into every aspect of my life, their insidious presence making it difficult to focus on anything else. I tried to immerse myself in routine, hoping that work and daily obligations would provide a distraction, but it was futile. Even in the midst of mundane tasks, I felt the forest calling to me, its voice a constant undercurrent that demanded my attention. My friends and colleagues began to notice the change in me, their concerned glances and probing questions only adding to my sense of isolation. How could I explain what I was experiencing without sounding insane? How could I put into words the way the forest had seeped into my very being, its essence entwining itself with mine like the roots of an ancient tree? One night, as the clock struck midnight and the world outside was cloaked in stillness, I reached my breaking point. The whispers had reached a crescendo, their haunting melody reverberating through my skull with an intensity that bordered on pain. I could no longer resist the pull, the inexorable force that dragged me toward the forest like a moth to a flame. Grabbing a flashlight and a sturdy jacket, I stepped out into the night, the cool air wrapping around me like a shroud. The path to the forest seemed to stretch before me, its contours illuminated by the pale light of the moon. My heart raced with a mixture of fear and anticipation as I crossed the threshold, the familiar scent of earth and decay enveloping me like an old, unwanted friend. The forest welcomed me with an unnatural quiet, its silence more oppressive than ever. The trees seemed to lean closer, their gnarled branches forming an almost sentient canopy that blocked out the stars. My flashlight cast a narrow beam of light that barely penetrated the darkness, its feeble glow doing little to dispel the sense of foreboding that hung heavy in the air. As I ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder, their disjointed syllables forming an almost coherent pattern. It was as though the forest was speaking to me directly, its voice a cacophony of emotions and sensations that defied comprehension. The path ahead was unfamiliar, the terrain shifting in ways that defied logic. It was as though the forest itself was reshaping around me, guiding me toward a destination I couldn't yet see. The trees seemed to breathe, their trunks expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched my own labored breaths. The ground beneath me felt alive, pulsing with an energy that resonated through my entire body. I stumbled forward, my every step fueled by compulsion I couldn't resist, even as my mind screamed at me to turn back. Eventually, I found myself in a clearing, though it was not the one I had encountered before. This one was smaller, more intimate, its boundaries defined by a ring of impossibly tall trees, whose branches intertwined to form a barrier that seemed almost impenetrable. In the center of the clearing stood an altar, its surface carved with the same enigmatic symbols I had seen on the cursed tree. The air here was different, heavier somehow, as though it were saturated with an ancient power that had lain dormant for centuries. The whispers reached a fever pitch, their voices converging into a single, unified chant that filled the clearing with an otherworldly resonance. I approached the altar with trembling hands, my flashlight casting eerie shadows across its surface. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift under the light, their meanings tantalizingly just out of reach. I reached out to touch one of the carvings, and the moment my fingers made contact, a surge of energy coursed through me, knocking the breath from my lungs and sending me stumbling backward. The forest seemed to come alive around me, its shadows coalescing into shapes that defied logic or reason. The air grew colder, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the clearing, reverberating through my very soul. It was then that I saw it, the creature from before, its form even more terrible in the moonlight. It emerged from the shadows like a living nightmare, its limbs elongated and unnatural, its eyes burning with a malevolent light that pierced through the darkness. It moved with an unsettling grace, its every step a calculated act of predation. It didn't speak, not in words, but its presence was enough to convey its intent. I was not an intruder, not exactly. I was something else, a participant in a ritual that had begun long before my time. The creature raised one of its twisted limbs, and the air around it seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. The symbols on the altar flared to life, their glow illuminating the clearing with an intensity that made my eyes water. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony that threatened to drown out my thoughts. I fell to my knees, my hands clutching at the earth as the ground beneath me trembled with a force that felt like the heartbeat of the forest itself. I don't know how long I remained there, my body trembling and my mind teetering on the edge of comprehension. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that otherworldly place, the minutes stretching into hours, or perhaps mere seconds. When the light finally dimmed and the whisper subsided, I found myself alone in the clearing, the creature and the altar both gone, as though they had never existed. The forest around me was eerily still, its oppressive silence replaced by the distant sound of birdsong. It was as though the forest had returned to its natural state, its malevolence receding like the tide. But I knew better. The forest had not released me. It had merely allowed me to leave. The mark it had left on me was indelible, a scar that would never fade. As I stumbled back toward the edge of the woods, the whispers lingered at the edge of my consciousness, a reminder that the forest was always watching, always waiting. I emerged into the pale light of dawn, my body battered and my soul weighed down by the knowledge of what I had seen. And yet, as I stand here now, staring at the line of trees that marks the forest's boundary. I can feel its call once more. The whispers are softer now, more like an invitation than a command. I know that to step back into the forest would be to risk everything, to confront the darkness that lurks within and the truth that it hides. But a part of me wonders if I ever truly left. Perhaps the forest is not a place, but a state of being, a shadow that dwells within us all, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And so I stand here, torn between the safety of the known and the allure of the unknown, knowing that the choice I make will define me forever. Story 3. The storm had settled into an eerie stillness by the time I arrived at the old family estate. The towering trees, flanking the long gravel driveway, swayed only slightly, their bare branches resembling skeletal fingers, clawing at the darkened sky. It wasn't my first time here, but the house seemed different, altered somehow. The exterior, once a familiar blend of worn wood and faded stone, now exuded a sinister aura I couldn't quite place. I chalked it up to the memories I'd been trying to bury, the ones that had crept into my dreams ever since Aunt Margaret's mysterious passing a month ago. Pushing the heavy oak door open, I stepped inside, greeted by the distinctive smell of aged wood and decay. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves harbored secrets too dark to reveal. The house had been in our family for generations, but no one had bothered to keep it up after Margaret retreated into isolation. Dust coated every surface, and the faint rustle of unseen critters echoed from the shadows. I reached for the light switch, but my fingers found nothing but cold, rough stone where it should have been. I fumbled in my pocket, pulling out my phone to use its flashlight. The beam of light trembled across the room as if the device itself was nervous. Furniture lay draped in white sheets that seemed to ripple, though the air was still. Shadows stretched and contracted, playing tricks on my eyes. At the far end of the room, a grand piano stood uncovered, its surface polished as though someone had been playing it recently. I approached cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the carpet. A single sheet of music rested on the piano stand, the notes scrawled in an unrecognizable, chaotic script. I reached for it, but a sudden thud from upstairs froze me mid-motion. My pulse quickened as I stared at the ceiling, straining to hear any further sounds. Nothing, just silence, so heavy it pressed against my eardrums. I wanted to convince myself that it had been the house settling, but something about the noise had an intentional quality, like the deliberate stomp of a boot. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. The staircase groaned under my weight, the sound amplified in the vast emptiness of the house. With each step, the sense of unease grew stronger, a coiling serpent in the pit of my stomach. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretched endlessly before me, shrouded in darkness that even my flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. Doors lined the corridor, each identical, each slightly ajar as if beckoning me to choose one. I moved forward, my hand brushing against the wall for balance. The peeling wallpaper felt strangely damp beneath my fingers, as though the house was alive and perspiring. I reached the third door on the left and pushed it open. The room beyond was small, sparsely furnished, and dominated by a large four-poster bed draped in moth-eaten curtains. The thud came again, louder this time, and unmistakably from within the room. I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam landing on an old wooden wardrobe in the corner. The doors rattled violently for a moment, then stopped as abruptly as they had begun. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, waiting for something, anything, to happen. When the silence stretched on, I took a hesitant step forward, then another. The air grew colder with each step until I could see my breath in front of me. My hand reached out, trembling as it grasped the iron handle. The wardrobe door creaked open, revealing only darkness within. The interior seemed impossibly deep, a yawning void that swallowed the light from my phone. A sudden gust of icy wind burst forth, extinguishing the flashlight and plunging me into total darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the phone, trying desperately to turn it back on. Just as the screen flickered to life, I felt it, a hand, cold and clammy, gripping my wrist with unnatural strength. I yanked my arm free and stumbled back, the flashlight beam swinging wildly. The wardrobe was now empty, its depths visible and mundane. My wrist throbbed where the unseen hand had grabbed me, a faint red mark already forming. I backed out of the room, the door slamming shut behind me as though it had a mind of its own. I didn't stop to catch my breath or rationalize what had just happened. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Descending the stairs 2 at a time, I headed for the study where Aunt Margaret had spent most of her final days. The door was ajar, and the faint scent of lavender, a smell I always associated with her, lingered in the air. The room was just as I remembered it, cluttered with books and papers, but there was an air of disarray that hadn't been there before. Drawers hung open, their contents spilled across the floor as though someone had been searching for something in a hurry. I moved to the desk, its surface dominated by a leather-bound journal. My hands trembled as I opened it, the pages filled with Margaret's familiar handwriting. The entries started innocuously enough, musings about the weather, notes on the garden, but they quickly descended into paranoia and fear. She wrote of hearing whispers in the night, of seeing shapes moving in the corners of her vision. The last entry was scrawled in a frantic hand. The house demands its due. I can't stop it. I can only delay. A sudden creak behind me sent my heart racing. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the shadows. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure, a tall, gaunt silhouette that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The air grew colder, the sense of being watched almost unbearable. I clutched the journal to my chest and bolted from the study, determined to leave the house and never return. But the house had other plans. The front door, which had opened so easily when I arrived, now refused to budge. The windows were similarly unyielding, their glass unbroken but as impenetrable as steel. The walls seemed to close in around me, the once familiar rooms, twisting into a labyrinth of corridors and dead ends. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let me go. As I write this, huddled in a corner with the journal as my only company, I can feel it watching me. The whispers Margaret wrote about have started, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. I don't know if anyone will find this, but if they do, heed my warning. This house is not what it seems. It is a predator, and I am its prey. The darkness is closing in now, and the whispers have become a cacophony. Whatever is coming, it's almost here, and I'm not sure I'll be able to stop it. Story 5. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought it was the wind. It was late evening, and I was deep in the woods, far from the safety of the village. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled branches twisting together like the fingers of some great, slumbering beast. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of underbrush as some unseen creature moved in the shadows. I had come to the forest to gather herbs, something I had done countless times before, but this time felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker, and the silence more oppressive. And then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like the rustle of leaves or the sigh of a distant breeze. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and strained to listen. The whisper came again, louder this time, and I realized with a jolt of fear that it wasn't the wind. It was a voice. I turned, my eyes scanning the shadows, but there was no one there. The forest was empty, the trees standing like silent sentinels in the fading light. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation and the eerie stillness of the woods were playing tricks on my mind. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they were coming from all around me. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches reaching out like claws, and the air grew colder, the warmth of the day fading as if the sun had never been there at all. I clutched my basket of herbs tightly, my knuckles white, and took a step back. The whispers followed me, their voices low and guttural, and I felt a surge of panic. I had to get out of the forest. Now, I turned and ran, my boots crunching on the frost-covered leaves as I sprinted down the narrow path. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel them pressing against my mind, their voices a chaotic jumble of words I couldn't quite understand. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting together to block my path, and I felt a surge of terror as I realized I was lost. The path I had followed so many times before was gone, swallowed by the shadows, and I was running blindly. my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were everywhere now, filling the air with a low, guttural hum that made my skin crawl, and I knew with a sickening certainty that I wasn't alone. Something was in the forest with me, something ancient and malevolent. I stumbled into a clearing, my legs giving out beneath me, and collapsed to the ground. The whispers stopped abruptly, the silence so sudden and complete that it was almost worse than the noise. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing stood a tree, but it was unlike any tree I had ever seen. Its trunk was twisted and scarred, its bark blackened as if it had been burned, and its branches reached out like skeletal fingers, clawing at the sky. Hanging from one of the branches was a lantern, its flame burning a sickly green, and beneath the tree was a circle of stones, arranged in a pattern that made my head ache just to look at them. And in the middle of that circle was a figure. It was humanoid, but only barely. Its body was tall and emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its bones, and its limbs were long and twisted, ending in clawed hands that scraped against the ground. Its face was the worst part, a grotesque mask of wood and bone, with hollow eyes that glowed like embers, and a mouth filled with jagged, splintered teeth. It tilted its head as it looked at me, and I could feel its gaze like a physical weight, pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl that made my chest ache. "But now that you are here, you will never leave." I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me, and took a step back. The creature didn't move, its hollow eyes fixed on me, and I felt a surge of panic. I had to get out of there. I had to run, but as I turned to flee, the ground beneath me gave way, and I fell into darkness. I woke up in a cavern, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. The lantern from the tree was there, its green flame casting an eerie glow on the walls, and I could see the creature standing over me, its hollow eyes burning with a fierce, malevolent light. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, held in place by some unseen force, and I felt a surge of terror as the creature leaned closer, its jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. "You are mine now," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. "You will serve me, as all who enter my domain must." I shook my head, my voice trembling. "No," I whispered. "Please. I didn't mean to come here. I didn't mean to disturb you." The creature laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made my chest ache. "It does not matter what you meant," it said. "You are here, and you will serve me, or you will die." I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out. The creature leaned closer, its breath hot and foul, and I knew I had to do something. Anything. I focused on the lantern, its green flame flickering faintly, and I felt a surge of energy, warm and electric, flowing through me. The creature's eyes widened, and it took a step back, its hollow gaze fixed on me. "What are you?" it snarled, its voice filled with rage and fear. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The energy was too much, too overwhelming, and I felt myself losing control. The creature lunged at me, its claws slashing through the air, but I raised my hand, and the energy surged, a blinding light filling the cavern as the creature was thrown back. It hit the wall with a sickening crunch, its body writhing as the energy tore through it, and I felt a surge of pain as the connection between us was severed. When the light faded, the creature was gone, its body reduced to a pile of ash, and I was alone. I stood, my legs shaking beneath me, and made my way out of the cavern. The forest was silent, the air thick with tension, and I knew that the creature was gone, but the forest was still alive, its presence a faint hum in the back of my mind. I knew it wasn't over, that the forest would always be a part of me. But for now, I was free. I had faced the demon, and I had won. And whatever came next, I knew I could face it. The forest seemed different as I stumbled back toward the village. The trees, once towering and oppressive, now felt almost watchful, as if they were alive and aware of my presence. The whispers that had haunted me earlier were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my ears like a weight. My body ached, every step sending a fresh wave of pain through my limbs, but I forced myself to keep moving. I couldn't stop. Not here. Not in the heart of the forest. The lantern's green flame had faded, leaving me in near darkness, but the faint glow of the golden lines on my arm guided my way. They pulsed softly, like a heartbeat, and I could feel the forest's energy flowing through me. Warm and electric, but tinged with something darker, something cold and hungry. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The village was just ahead, its familiar rooftops and chimneys a welcome sight. But I hesitated. What would I tell them? How could I explain what had happened? The villagers already feared the forest, and if they knew the truth, that I had faced a demon and survived, they would fear me too. I looked down at my arm, the golden lines glowing faintly in the early morning light, and felt a surge of dread. I wasn't the same person who had entered the forest. The demon was gone, but its mark remained, and I knew it would never fade. I slipped into the village quietly, avoiding the main streets and sticking to the shadows. The few people who were awake at this hour didn't notice me. Their attention focused on their morning chores, and I was grateful for the anonymity. I made my way to my small cottage on the edge of the village, my heart pounding as I pushed open the door. Lila was there, sitting by the fire, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as I entered, her eyes widening with relief, and rushed to my side. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I've been so worried. I thought you were gone." I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here," I said, "but something happened. Something. I don't know how to explain." She looked at me, her eyes filled with worry, and I knew I had to tell her the truth. I took a deep breath and began to speak, my words tumbling out in a rush as I recounted everything that had happened. The whispers, the clearing, the demon, and the strange energy that had flowed through me. When I finished, she was silent, her face pale but resolute. "You're different now," she said finally, "but that doesn't mean you're lost. We'll figure this out. Together." Her words were a comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest's presence was still there, a faint hum in the back of my mind, and I knew it wasn't done with me. The golden lines on my arm pulsed faintly, their light growing brighter as the day wore on, and I felt a surge of unease. What had I become? And what would the forest demand of me next? The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and unease. The villagers avoided me, their eyes filled with fear and suspicion, and I couldn't blame them. I had changed, and they could sense it. The golden lines on my arm had spread, creeping up my shoulder and across my chest, and the hum in my mind had grown louder, more insistent. I could feel the forest calling to me, its voice a low, persistent whisper that I couldn't ignore. It wanted me to return, to take my place as its new heart, and the thought filled me with a mixture of dread and longing. Lila stayed close to me, her presence a constant comfort, but even she seemed different. She was quieter, more withdrawn, and I often caught her staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear exactly, but something deeper, something that made my chest ache. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but I was afraid of the answer, afraid that she would tell me I had changed, that I wasn't the same person who had gone into the forest to save her. And maybe she would have been right. The golden lines on my arm pulsed faintly, their light casting an eerie glow on the walls of our cottage, and I knew that I was no longer fully human. The forest had claimed me, and there was no escaping it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers had grown too loud, too insistent, and I felt like I was being pulled in two directions at once. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lila, and made my way to the edge of the village. The forest loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette outlined against the moonlit sky, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't want to go back, but I knew I had to. The connection between me and the forest was too strong, too deep, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest, and stepped onto the path. The forest was different this time. The trees seemed taller, their branches reaching out like claws, and the air was thick with a strange, electric energy. The golden lines on my arm pulsed faintly, their light casting an eerie glow on the ground, and I could feel the forest's presence all around me, watching, waiting. I followed the path, my steps slow and hesitant, and as I walked, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just in my mind anymore, they were all around me, filling the air with a low, guttural hum that made my skin crawl. I wanted to turn back, to run as far away as I could, but I knew it was too late. The forest had claimed me, and there was no escaping it. I reached the clearing, the ancient oak tree looming over me like a silent sentinel, and I felt a surge of panic. The lantern still hung from its branch, its green flame flickering faintly, and the circle of stones was still there, arranged in the same pattern that had made my head ache before. But something was different. The air was thicker, heavier, and I could feel the demon's presence, cold and hungry, in the back of my mind. It was waiting for me, and I knew I had no choice but to face it. I stepped into the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest, and the moment I did, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The trees swayed, their branches creaking and groaning, and the air was filled with a low, rumbling growl that made my skin crawl. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, and saw the demon emerging from the shadows. Its body was still encased in the shell of glowing bark, but its eyes burned with a fierce, malevolent light, and I could feel its rage, its hunger, as it advanced toward me. "You came back," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl that made my chest ache. "I knew you would. You cannot resist the call of the forest. You are mine now, bound to me by the heart you took." I shook my head, my voice trembling. "I'm not yours," I said. "I came back to end this, to free myself from you." The demon laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "You cannot free yourself," it said. "You are a part of me now, just as I am a part of you. The heart you took has bound us together, and there is no escaping it." I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out. The golden lines on my arm pulsed faintly, their light growing brighter, and I realized with a start that the energy from the fruit was still inside me, connecting me to the forest, to the demon. I focused on it, on the warmth and the coldness, and I felt it shift, responding to my will. The ground beneath me began to tremble, the trees swaying as the energy surged through me, and I knew I had to act fast. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the demon's chest. The moment I did, the energy exploded, a blinding light, filling the clearing as the connection between us surged. I felt the demon's presence, cold and hungry, in the back of my mind, and I focused all of my will on pushing it out, on breaking the bond that held us together. The demon roared in fury, its body writhing as the energy tore through it, and I felt a surge of pain as the connection between us was severed. When the light faded, I was on my knees, my body trembling with exhaustion. The demon was gone, its body reduced to a pile of ash, and the forest was silent, the air thick with tension. I looked down at my hand, the golden lines still pulsing faintly, and I felt a surge of relief. The demon was gone, but the connection to the forest remained, a faint hum in the back of my mind. I knew it wasn't over, that the forest would always be a part of me. But for now, I was free. I stood, my legs shaking beneath me, and made my way back to the village. The sun was rising, its light casting a warm glow over the trees, and I felt a surge of hope. The demon was gone, but the forest was still alive, its presence a faint hum in the back of my mind. I knew it would always be a part of me, but I also knew that I had the strength to face it. I had taken the heart of the forest, and in doing so, I had become something more, something stronger. When I reached the village, Lila was waiting for me, her eyes filled with worry. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head, my own voice barely a whisper. "I had to go back," I said. "I had to face it." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief, and I knew that she understood. The forest was a part of me now, and it always would be. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had faced the demon, and I had won. And whatever came next, I knew I could face it, together. To be real, yet too distinct to be my imagination. My heart pounded. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something lurking beyond the reach of my light. I took another step forward, Then another, the underbrush crunching softly beneath my boots. The sound of my own breath filled my ears, shallow and uneven. The trees around me no longer looked natural. Their trunks were twisted, their bark scarred and blackened as if scorched by fire. The deeper I went, the more I realized there was no sound. No insects chirping, no rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth. The forest had gone silent, kind of silence that doesn't belong in a living place. That was when I saw them. Eyes. Not one pair, not two, but dozens, glimmering in the darkness, just beyond my flashlight's reach. They blinked in unison, reflecting the faint beam like the eyes of wolves. Yet there was something wrong with them. They were too high up, hovering in the air like stars against the black sky. And they did not move with the skittish curiosity of animals. They were watching, waiting. I wanted to run. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and flee, but my body refused to obey. The air had grown thick, pressing down on me like an unseen hand. I tried to swallow, but my throat was dry, my limbs frozen in place. The whispering came again, this time from all around me, a low murmur threading through the trees. It was neither male nor female, neither soft nor loud. It was simply there, sinking into my bones, curling around my thoughts like ivy. My skin prickled as I strained to understand the words, but they slithered past my comprehension, foreign yet familiar. The eyes blinked again, and I knew I was not alone. A shadow moved between the trees, something massive yet unnervingly silent. My light wavered, catching only glimpses of shifting limbs, of something long and sinewy unfurling from the darkness. The creature was tall, impossibly tall, its form almost human but stretched, elongated in ways that defied nature. Its arms hung too low, nearly dragging against the ground, its fingers too thin, too long. The skin, or what passed for skin, was dark as the forest itself, blending seamlessly with the night. But the worst part, thing that sent ice flooding my veins, was its face. There wasn't one, or perhaps there were too many. Shapes shifted across where its features should have been, flickering like shadows in candlelight, faces appearing and vanishing in an instant. Some were screaming, some weeping, some expressionless and empty. Their eyes locked onto mine before they disappeared into the abyss of its form. The whispers grew louder, no longer distant, but curling around my ears like tendrils. The voices spoke in harmony, an eerie, layered sound that made my head throb. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then died. Darkness swallowed me whole. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stood frozen, unable to see, unable to move. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat hammering in my chest, and the whispers growing louder, pressing against my skull, filling every corner of my mind. Then a touch, cold, thin, impossibly light, fingertips grazing my shoulder. A jolt of terror shot through me, my body finally obeying as I staggered backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My voice was gone, stolen by the suffocating air, by the terror that gripped my throat like a vice. I didn't know if I screamed. I didn't know if I ran. All I knew was that the darkness had changed, that something was moving within it, something that had been waiting for me. I don't know how long I wandered, my legs moving on their own, my hands outstretched to feel the unseen path ahead. The trees had become a maze, their trunks twisting in unnatural angles, forming shapes that did not belong in this world. Every step felt wrong, as if the ground itself resented my presence. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold seeping into my bones. The whispering never stopped. It had become a constant, a song without rhythm, a chant that grew clearer the longer I listened. It wasn't just voices. It was them, the faces, the ones I had seen on the creature. They were speaking, calling to me, begging, warning. I wanted to cover my ears, to block them out, but the sound wasn't just around me. It was inside me. The first scream shattered the night. It wasn't mine. It came from ahead, piercing, raw, filled with a terror I couldn't begin to comprehend. Then another, and another, dozens of voices shrieking in agony, echoing through the trees. The darkness rippled. The shadows moved. I was not alone. I had never been alone. The eyes returned, blinking in the void, surrounding me. I ran. I don't remember deciding to run, but my legs carried me forward, the branches clawing at my skin, the unseen roots threatening to drag me down. The whispers turned into wails, a chorus of despair rising behind me, chasing me through the twisted forest. The ground felt unstable, as though something beneath it was shifting, writhing, waiting to pull me under. My lungs burned, my body screaming for rest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I knew, deep in my bones, that stopping meant surrendering. Stopping meant becoming part of whatever lived in this place. The trees thinned, the shadows retreating, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I saw light ahead, a faint, golden glow cutting through the blackness. Hope flared in my chest. I pushed forward, my legs numb, my vision blurred with exhaustion. The glow grew brighter, the whispers grew fainter, and then I was falling. I hit the ground hard, my body rolling onto damp grass, my breath ragged. When I lifted my head, I was no longer in the forest. The trees loomed behind me, but they were different now, less twisted, less alive. The sky above was a dull gray, the first hints of dawn breaking through. I was at the edge of the woods, lying on the ground as if I had simply collapsed there. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen, what had followed me. I turned back, my heart hammering as I stared into the tree-line, expecting to see the eyes, the shifting shadows, the faceless horror. But there was nothing. Only the trees, standing silent, unmoving. The forest had let me go. For now. I didn't move for a long time. My limbs were heavy, my breath shallow, my body trembling with exhaustion and something deeper, something I didn't want to name. Fear, not the fleeting kind, not the fear of a bad dream or a distant danger, but something that had taken root in my bones, something that would never leave me. I had escaped. I had made it out, and yet I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I wasn't truly free. The forest was watching. Even now, I dragged myself upright, my legs weak beneath me, my skin damp with sweat and morning dew. My hands were shaking as I reached into my pocket for my phone. Dead, of course. My flashlight, too. Everything electronic had stopped working the moment I stepped into that cursed place. I swallowed hard and forced myself to turn around, to truly look at the forest behind me. In the light of dawn, it seemed almost normal. Almost. The trees were just trees now, tall and unmoving, their branches no longer writhing like grasping fingers. The underbrush was thick, undisturbed. No signs of the nightmare that had unfolded within. But I knew better. I knew the truth. I had felt the cold fingers on my shoulder. I had seen the faceless thing shifting in the dark. I had heard the whispers, the screams, the wails of souls lost within that cursed place. And worst of all, I knew it wasn't over. A breeze rolled past, rustling the leaves, carrying the familiar scent of damp earth. For a moment, just a brief, fleeting second, I heard it again, the whispering. Faint, almost distant. A single word. Soon, I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My pulse thundered in my ears. It was a warning, a promise. I turned and ran. The road wasn't far. My car was still there, parked exactly where I had left it, though it felt like an eternity had passed. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers clumsy and numb, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The door creaked as I threw it open, collapsed into the driver's seat, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, a sound so normal, so painfully real, that it almost broke me. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. I needed to get out of here. Now, as I pulled onto the road, my tires kicking up gravel, I stole one last glance at the forest in my rearview mirror. The trees stood still, bathed in the morning light, ordinary and harmless. But just before I turned the corner, just before the forest disappeared from view, I saw it. A figure, tall, unnaturally thin, standing just beyond the tree line, watching me. I pressed my foot down on the gas, the car surging forward, my heart a drumbeat in my chest. The road stretched ahead, winding and endless, but I didn't care where it led, as long as it was away from here. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me go. but it would never let me leave. Story 2. The forest was never silent, not truly. But tonight it was different. The usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves had been replaced by a heavy, unnatural stillness, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I stood at the edge of the woods, the moonlight casting long, jagged shadows across the ground, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't just the eerie quiet or the way the wind seemed to whisper my name, though that alone was enough to send a chill down my spine. No, it was the eyes, those glowing, amber eyes that flickered in the darkness, just beyond the reach of my lantern's feeble light. I told myself it was an animal, a deer or a fox, but deep down, I knew better. Animals don't smile. I shouldn't have been here. No one came to Blackthorn Forest after sundown, not even the hunters. The stories were too old, too ingrained in the fabric of the town to ignore. They spoke of a demon that roamed these woods, a creature born of shadow and malice, with a hunger that could never be sated. It was said to take the form of whatever you feared most, to lure you deeper into the trees until you were lost, until you were it. I had always dismissed the tales as superstition, the kind of thing parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far. But now, standing here with the weight of the forest pressing down on me, I wasn't so sure. The lantern trembled in my hand as I took a step forward, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots unnaturally loud in the silence. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They just stared, unblinking, unwavering, as if they could see straight through me. I told myself to turn back, to run while I still could, but my feet carried me forward, as if pulled by some unseen force. The air grew colder with every step, the shadows thicker, until I could barely see the path ahead. And then, just as I was about to turn back, the eyes vanished. For a moment, I thought I was alone again, that whatever had been watching me had grown bored and moved on. But then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too deep, too resonant, too full of something I couldn't quite place. Hatred, maybe, or hunger. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, the lantern swinging wildly, casting flickering light on the trees. There was nothing there, just the endless, oppressive darkness. But I could feel it, closer now, its presence like a weight on my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to steady it. The forest swallowed the words, leaving only silence in their wake. And then, from the shadows, came a voice that was both familiar and alien, a voice that seemed to echo in my mind rather than my ears. "You shouldn't have come," it said, the words dripping with a malice that made my blood run cold. I knew that voice. It was mine. I stumbled backward, the lantern slipping from my grasp and shattering on the ground, plunging me into darkness. The eyes reappeared, closer this time, close enough that I could see the faint outline of a figure, tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and twist in ways that defied nature. It stepped into the moonlight, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was me, or rather, it was a twisted, grotesque version of me, with skin the color of ash and eyes that burned like embers. Its mouth stretched into a grin, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. "You've been running for so long," it said, its voice a perfect mimicry of my own. "But you can't run from yourself." I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the forest floor, the sound of my own laughter echoing in my ears. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches clawing at my skin as I pushed through them. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. All that mattered was getting away, putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel it behind me, its breath hot on the back of my neck, its laughter growing louder with every step. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run anymore, I burst into a clearing. The moonlight bathed the space in an eerie silver glow, illuminating the figure standing in the center. It was the demon, but it wasn't me anymore. It had taken on a new form, one that was somehow even more terrifying. A towering, skeletal figure with antlers that stretched toward the sky, its body wreathed in shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. It turned to face me, its hollow eyes locking onto mine, and I knew I was trapped. "You can't escape," it said, its voice a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from all around me. "You belong to the forest now." I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything but stand there, frozen in fear. But I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The demon raised a clawed hand, and the shadows surged forward, wrapping around me like a cocoon. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was its smile, wide and cruel, and the last thing I heard was its voice, whispering in my ear, "Welcome home." The darkness was suffocating, a living, breathing entity that pressed against me from all sides. I couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't even scream. The shadows coiled around me like serpents, their cold, slithering touch sending waves of terror through my body. I tried to fight, to claw my way out, but my hands met only empty air. It was as if I no longer had a body, as if I had been reduced to nothing more than a consciousness trapped in an endless void. And then, just as suddenly as it had enveloped me, the darkness began to recede, pulling away like a tide retreating from the shore. I found myself standing in the middle of the forest again, but it wasn't the same forest I had entered. The trees were taller, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy, as if it had been soaked in something I didn't want to think about. The moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting strange, shifting patterns on the forest floor. And then I saw it, the demon, standing at the edge of the clearing, its antlered silhouette stark against the pale light. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me with those hollow, burning eyes. I wanted to run, to turn and flee as fast as my legs could carry me, but something held me in place. It wasn't fear, though that was certainly part of it. It was something deeper, something primal, a sense that running would only make things worse. So I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, and waited for it to make the first move. When it finally did, it wasn't what I expected. Instead of attacking, it simply tilted its head to the side, as if studying me. The shadows around it writhed and twisted, forming shapes that I couldn't quite make out, faces, maybe, or hands, reaching out toward me. And then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the very ground beneath my feet. "You've been running for so long," it said, its words echoing in my mind. "But you can't run from what you are." I wanted to deny it, to scream that I wasn't whatever it thought I was, but the words caught in my throat, because deep down I knew it was right. I had been running, not just from the demon, but from myself, from the things I had done, the choices I had made, the person I had become. And now, standing here in this twisted, nightmare version of the forest, I realized that there was no escape, not from the demon, and not from myself. The demon took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. The shadows around it surged forward, wrapping around my legs and pulling me toward it. I tried to resist, to dig my heels into the soft ground, but it was no use. The shadows were too strong, their grip unbreakable. And then, just as I was about to be pulled into the demon's embrace, something changed. The air around me grew warmer, the oppressive darkness lifting just enough for me to see a faint glow in the distance. It was a soft, golden light, like the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. The demon hissed, its form flickering as if the light was causing it pain. The shadows around me loosened their grip, and I stumbled forward, toward the light. I didn't know what it was, or where it was coming from, but I knew I had to reach it. It was my only chance. I ran, my feet pounding against the soft ground, the light growing brighter with every step. The demon's growls turned to snarls of rage, and I could feel the shadows reaching for me, trying to pull me back. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The light was my only hope, my only chance of escape. And then, just as I was about to reach it, I felt something grab my ankle, yanking me off my feet and sending me crashing to the ground. I twisted around, kicking at the shadowy tendril that had wrapped around my leg. But it was no use. The demon was there, its hollow eyes burning with fury, its antlered silhouette looming over me. It raised a clawed hand, and I braced myself for the end. But then, just as it was about to strike, the light surged forward, enveloping me in its warm, golden glow. The demon screamed, a sound that was equal parts rage and pain, and the shadows around it recoiled, shrinking back into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, and turned toward the source of the light. It was a figure, humanoid but glowing with an otherworldly radiance, its features indistinct but somehow familiar. It reached out a hand toward me, and without thinking, I took it. The moment our hands touched, the forest around us dissolved, the twisted trees and oppressive darkness replaced by a vast, open plain bathed in golden light. The figure beside me turned, and I finally got a clear look at its face. It was me, or rather, a version of me, one that glowed with an inner light, its eyes filled with a calm, steady strength. "You've been running for so long," it said, its voice soft but firm. "But you can't run from what you are. You have to face it." I wanted to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew it was right. I had been running, not just from the demon, but from myself, from the things I had done, the choices I had made, the person I had become. And now, standing here in this place of light, I realized that there was no escape, not from the demon and not from myself. The figure, my other self, nodded, as if it could hear my thoughts. "You have to face it," it repeated, "but you don't have to do it alone." And then, before I could respond, the light began to fade, the golden plain dissolving into darkness once more. I felt myself falling, tumbling through an endless void, until I landed back in the forest, the twisted trees and oppressive darkness closing in around me once more. But this time I wasn't alone. The demon was there, its hollow eyes burning with fury, its antlered silhouette looming over me. But so was the light, a faint, golden glow that seemed to emanate from within me, pushing back the shadows just enough to give me a fighting chance. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and faced the demon. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't just running anymore. I was fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The demon lunged at me, its claws slashing through the air, but I sidestepped, the golden light flaring brighter as I moved. I could feel it now, the strength it gave me, the clarity it brought to my thoughts. The demon snarled, its form flickering as the light touched it, but it didn't back down. It came at me again, and this time I was ready. I met its attack head on, the light surging forward to meet the shadows. The impact sent a shockwave through the forest, the trees trembling as the two forces collided. The demon screamed, its form wavering, but it didn't retreat. It pressed forward, its claws slashing at me, its eyes burning with a hatred that was almost palpable. But I held my ground, the light within me growing stronger with every passing moment. And then, just as I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, the demon faltered. Its form flickered, the shadows around it dissipating, and for a moment I saw something else, a flicker of fear in its hollow eyes. It was afraid of the light, afraid of me. And in that moment, I realized that I had the upper hand. I pressed forward, the light surging around me, driving the demon back. It snarled and hissed, its form flickering as it tried to resist, but it was no use. The light was too strong, too pure. And then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, the demon dissolved, its form collapsing into a cloud of shadow that was quickly consumed by the light. I stood there, breathing heavily, the golden glow slowly fading as the forest around me returned to normal. The twisted trees straightened, the oppressive darkness lifted, and the air grew warm and sweet once more. I had done it. I had faced the demon, faced myself, and come out on top. But as I stood there, basking in the glow of my victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The demon was gone, yes, but the forest was still there, vast and ancient and full of secrets. And somewhere, deep within its heart, I knew there were more shadows waiting, more demons to face. But for now I was safe. For now I had won. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and turned to leave the forest behind. As I walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing, amber eyes watching me from the shadows. They weren't there, of course, but the feeling remained, a lingering sense of unease that followed me all the way home. And as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the thought that the demon wasn't truly gone. It was still out there, waiting, watching, and one day it would come for me again. But next time, I would be ready. Next time, I wouldn't run. Next time, I would face it head on, and I would win. Because I wasn't just running anymore. I was fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days that followed my encounter with the demon were a blur. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the forest had released its grip on me. But the truth was, I could still feel it, a faint, lingering presence, like a shadow just out of the corner of my eye. It was there when I woke up in the morning, a cold shiver running down my spine as I opened my eyes. It was there when I walked through town, the whispers of the wind carrying faint, unintelligible words that sounded almost like my name. And it was there at night, when the darkness outside my window seemed to press against the glass, waiting for me to let my guard down. I tried to distract myself, to focus on the mundane tasks of everyday life, but it was no use. The forest had changed me, and I couldn't go back to the person I was before. I could still feel the golden light that had saved me, a faint warmth in my chest that pulsed faintly, like a second heartbeat. It was a reminder of what I had faced, of what I had overcome, but it was also a warning. The demon was gone, but the forest wasn't, and neither were the shadows. It was on the seventh night that I heard the voice again. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to will myself to sleep, when it came, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You think it's over," it said, the words dripping with malice. "But it's only just begun." I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and looked around the room. There was nothing there, just the familiar shapes of my furniture bathed in the pale light of the moon. But I could feel it, the presence, the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. I got out of bed and walked to the window, my hands trembling as I pulled back the curtains. The forest was there, just beyond the edge of town, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. And for a moment, I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement, a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. I stepped back from the window, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was still on edge from what had happened. But deep down, I knew better. The demon was gone, but the forest wasn't, and it was calling me back. I didn't want to go. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay away, to lock the doors and windows and never set foot in the forest again. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong, an almost physical force that drew me toward the trees, toward the darkness. I tried to resist, to fight it, but it was no use. The forest had claimed me, and there was no escape. I dressed quickly, my hand shaking as I pulled on my boots and grabbed my coat. The house was silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the knob, and for a moment I thought about turning back. But then the voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "You can't run," it said. "You belong to the forest." I opened the door and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The town was quiet, the streets empty, the houses dark. It felt like I was the only person left in the world, like everything else had been swallowed by the shadows. I walked quickly, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and before I knew it, I was standing at the edge of the forest once more. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy, as if it had been soaked in something I didn't want to think about. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and stepped into the trees. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world around me changed. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker, until I could barely see the path ahead. The golden light in my chest pulsed faintly, a faint warmth that pushed back the darkness, just enough to keep me from being swallowed whole. I walked slowly, my senses on high alert, every sound, every movement sending a jolt of fear through me. And then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, a soft, golden light that seemed to beckon me forward. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to turn back, but the pull was too strong. I walked toward the light, my footsteps slow and deliberate, the shadows around me shifting and twisting as if they were alive. The light grew brighter as I approached, until I could see its source, a small clearing in the middle of the forest, bathed in a warm, golden glow. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, humanoid but glowing with an otherworldly radiance, its features indistinct but somehow familiar. It was the same figure I had seen before, the one that had saved me from the demon, and now it was here again. I stepped into the clearing, the golden light washing over me, and the figure turned to face me. Its eyes were filled with a calm, steady strength, and for a moment I felt a sense of peace, like I had finally found what I was looking for. But then it spoke, its voice soft but firm, and the peace was shattered. "You've been running for so long," it said, "but you can't run from what you are. You have to face it." I wanted to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew it was right. I had been running, not just from the demon, but from myself, from the things I had done, the choices I had made, the person I had become. And now, standing here in this place of light, I realized that there was no escape, not from the forest, and not from myself. The figure, my other self, nodded, as if it could hear my thoughts. "You have to face it," it repeated, "but you don't have to do it alone." And then, before I could respond, the light began to fade, the golden glow dissolving into darkness once more. I felt myself falling, tumbling through an endless void, until I landed back in the forest, the twisted trees and oppressive darkness closing in around me once more. But this time I wasn't alone. The demon was there, its hollow eyes burning with fury, its antlered silhouette looming over me. But so was the light, a faint, golden glow that seemed to emanate from within me, pushing back the shadows just enough to give me a fighting chance. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and faced the demon. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't just running anymore. I was fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The demon lunged at me, its claws slashing through the air. But I sidestepped, the golden light flaring brighter as I moved. I could feel it now, the strength it gave me, the clarity it brought to my thoughts. The demon snarled, its form flickering as the light touched it, but it didn't back down. It came at me again, and this time I was ready. I met its attack head on, the light surging forward to meet the shadows. The impact sent a shockwave through the forest, the trees trembling as the two forces collided. The demon screamed, its form wavering, but it didn't retreat. It pressed forward, its claws slashing at me, its eyes burning with hatred that was almost palpable. But I held my ground, the light within me growing stronger with every passing moment. And then, just as I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, the demon faltered. Its form flickered, the shadows around it dissipating, and for a moment I saw something else, a flicker of fear in its hollow eyes. It was afraid of the light, afraid of me. And in that moment, I realized that I had the upper hand. I pressed forward, the light surging around me, driving the demon back. It snarled and hissed, its form flickering as it tried to resist, but it was no use. The light was too strong, too pure. And then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, the demon dissolved, its form collapsing into a cloud of shadow that was quickly consumed by the light. I stood there, breathing heavily, the golden glow slowly fading as the forest around me returned to normal. The twisted trees straightened, the oppressive darkness lifted, and the air grew warm and sweet once more. I had done it. I had faced the demon, faced myself, and come out on top. But as I stood there, basking in the glow of my victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The demon was gone, yes, but the forest was still there, vast and ancient and full of secrets. And somewhere, deep within its heart, I knew there were more shadows waiting, more demons to face. But for now, I was safe. For now, I had won. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and turned to leave the forest behind. But as I walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing, amber eyes watching me from the shadows. They weren't there, of course, but the feeling remained, a lingering sense of unease that followed me all the way home. And as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the thought that the demon wasn't truly gone. It was still out there, waiting, watching. And one day, it would come for me again. But next time, I would be ready. Next time, I wouldn't run. Next time, I would face it head on, and I would win. Because I wasn't just running anymore. I was fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days that followed were a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief, because the immediate threat was gone. The demon had been vanquished, and the forest seemed quieter, less oppressive. But the unease never fully left me. It lingered in the back of my mind, a constant whisper that something was still wrong. The golden light in my chest, the one that had saved me, still pulsed faintly, a reminder that the battle wasn't truly over. It was as if the forest had marked me, claimed me in a way I couldn't fully understand. And no matter how hard I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still connected to it, bound by some unseen force. I tried to distract myself with work, with the mundane routines of daily life, but it was no use. The forest was always there, lurking at the edge of my thoughts, its presence a constant weight on my shoulders. I found myself drawn to it, even though I knew I shouldn't be. I would catch myself staring out the window, my eyes fixed on the distant tree line, as if waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. And at night, I would dream of it, the twisted trees, the oppressive darkness, the glowing eyes that watched me from the shadows. The dreams were always the same, a relentless cycle of fear and desperation that left me exhausted when I woke. It was on the 10th night that I finally gave in. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to will myself to sleep, when the pull became too strong to ignore. It was as if the forest was calling to me, its voice a low, insistent whisper that I couldn't block out. I got out of bed and dressed quickly, my hands trembling as I pulled on my boots and grabbed my coat. The house was silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the knob, and for a moment I thought about turning back. But then the voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "You can't run," it said. "You belong to the forest." I opened the door and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The town was quiet, the streets empty, the houses dark. It felt like I was the only person left in the world, like everything else had been swallowed by the shadows. I walked quickly, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and before I knew it, I was standing at the edge of the forest once more. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy, as if it had been soaked in something I didn't want to think about. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and stepped into the trees. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world around me changed. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker, until I could barely see the path ahead. The golden light in my chest pulsed faintly, a faint warmth that pushed back the darkness, just enough to keep me from being swallowed whole. I walked slowly, my senses on high alert, every sound, every movement sending a jolt of fear through me. And then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, a soft, golden light that seemed to beckon me forward. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to turn back, but the pull was too strong. I walked toward the light, my footsteps slow and deliberate, the shadows around me shifting and twisting as if they were alive. The light grew brighter as I approached, until I could see its source, a small clearing in the middle of the forest, bathed in a warm, golden glow. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, humanoid but glowing with an otherworldly radiance, its features indistinct but somehow familiar. It was the same figure I had seen before, the one that had saved me from the demon. And now it was here again. I stepped into the clearing, the golden light washing over me, and the figure turned to face me. Its eyes were filled with a calm, steady strength, and for a moment I felt a sense of peace, like I had finally found what I was looking for. But then it spoke, its voice soft but firm, and the peace was shattered. "You've been running for so long," it said, "but you can't run from what you are. You have to face it." I wanted to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew it was right. I had been running, not just from the demon, but from myself, from the things I had done, choices I had made, the person I had become. And now, standing here in this place of light, I realized that there was no escape, not from the forest, and not from myself. The figure, my other self, nodded, as if it could hear my thoughts. "You have to face it," it repeated, "but you don't have to do it alone." And then, before I could respond, the light began to fade, the golden glow dissolving into darkness once more. I felt myself falling, tumbling through an endless void, until I landed back in the forest, the twisted trees and oppressive darkness closing in around me once more. But this time I wasn't alone. The demon was there, its hollow eyes burning with fury, its antlered silhouette looming over me. But so was the light, a faint, golden glow that seemed to emanate from within me, pushing back the shadows just enough to give me a fighting chance. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and faced the demon. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't just running anymore. I was fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The demon lunged at me, its claws slashing through the air, but I sidestepped, the golden light flaring brighter as I moved. I could feel it now, the strength it gave me, the clarity it brought to my thoughts. The demon snarled, its form flickering as the light touched it, but it didn't back down. It came at me again, and this time I was ready. I met its attack head-on, the light surging forward to meet the shadows. The impact sent a shockwave through the forest, the trees trembling as the two forces collided. The demon screamed, its form wavering, but it didn't retreat. It pressed forward, its claws slashing at me, its eyes burning with a hatred that was almost palpable. But I held my ground, the light within me growing stronger with every passing moment. And then, just as I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, the demon faltered, its form flickered, the shadows around it dissipating, and for a moment I saw something else, a flicker of fear in its hollow eyes. It was afraid of the light, afraid of me. And in that moment, I realized that I had the upper hand. I pressed forward, the light surging around me, driving the demon back. It snarled and hissed, its form flickering as it tried to resist, but it was no use. The light was too strong, too pure. And then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, the demon dissolved, its form collapsing into a cloud of shadow that was quickly consumed by the light. I stood there, breathing heavily, the golden glow slowly fading as the forest around me returned to normal. The twisted trees straightened, the oppressive darkness lifted, and the air grew warm and sweet once more. I had done it. I had faced the demon, faced myself, and come out on top. But as I stood there, basking in the glow of my victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The demon was gone, yes, but the forest was still there, vast and ancient and full of secrets. And somewhere, deep within its heart, I knew there were more shadows waiting, more demons to face. But for now I was safe. For now I had won. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and turned to leave the forest behind. But as I walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing, amber eyes watching me from the shadows. They weren't there, of course, but the feeling remained, a lingering sense of unease that followed me all the way home. Story 3. The first time I saw the cabin. It was through a veil of rain so thick it felt like the sky was trying to wash the world away. I had been driving for hours, lost on back roads that twisted and turned like serpents through the dense forest. My GPS had given up long ago, its screen flickering and dying with a final, pitiful beep. The storm had rolled in out of nowhere, turning the already dim afternoon into a twilight of gray and green. The trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches clawing at the sky, and the rain hammered down so hard I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. I was about to give up, to pull over and wait out the storm, when I saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the rain and the shadows, but as I drove closer, the light grew brighter, and I realized it was coming from a cabin. It was small and weathered, its wooden walls dark with age and moisture, but the glow from its windows was warm and inviting. I didn't think twice. I pulled off the road and parked my car, grabbing my bag and sprinting through the downpour to the cabin's front door. The door creaked open before I could knock, revealing a man standing in the doorway. He was tall and thin, with a face that seemed carved from the same wood as the cabin. His eyes were deep-set and shadowed, but they held a glimmer of something I couldn't quite place. Curiosity, maybe, or suspicion. He didn't say anything, just stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy, as if it had been soaked in something I didn't want to think about. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and stepped into the trees. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world around me changed. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker, until I could barely see the path ahead. The golden light in my chest pulsed faintly, a faint warmth that pushed back the darkness, just enough to keep me from being swallowed whole. I walked slowly, my senses on high alert, every sound, every movement sending a jolt of fear through me. And then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, a soft, golden light that seemed to beckon me forward. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to turn back, but the pull was too strong. I walked toward the light, my footsteps slow and deliberate, the shadows around me shifting and twisting as if they were alive. The light grew brighter as I approached, until I could see its source, a small clearing in the middle of the forest, bathed in a warm, golden glow. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, humanoid but glowing with an otherworldly radiance, its features indistinct but somehow familiar. It was the same figure I had seen before, the one that had saved me from the demon, and now it was here again. I stepped into the clearing, the golden light washing over me, and the figure turned to face me. Its eyes were filled with a calm, steady strength, and for a moment I felt a sense of peace, like I had finally found what I was looking for. But then it spoke, its voice soft but firm, and the peace was shattered. "You've been running for so long," it said, "but you can't run from what you are. You have to face it." I wanted to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew it was right. I had been running, not just from the demon, but from myself, from the things I had done, the choices I had made, the person I had become. And now, standing here in this place of light, I realized that there was no escape, not from the forest, and not from myself. The figure, my other self, nodded, as if it could hear my thoughts. "You have to face it," it repeated, "but you don't have to do it alone." And then, before I could respond, the light began to fade, the golden glow dissolving into darkness once more. I felt myself falling, tumbling through an endless void, until I landed back in the forest, the twisted trees and oppressive darkness closing in around me once more. But this time I wasn't alone. The demon was there, its hollow eyes burning with fury, its antlered silhouette looming over me. But so was the light, a faint, golden glow that seemed to emanate from within me, pushing back the shadows just enough to give me a fighting chance. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and faced the demon. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't just running anymore. I was fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The demon lunged at me, its claws slashing through the air, but I sidestepped, the golden light flaring brighter as I moved. I could feel it now, the strength it gave me, the clarity it brought to my thoughts. The demon snarled, its form flickering as the light touched it, but it didn't back down. It came at me again, and this time I was ready. I met its attack head-on, the light surging forward to meet the shadows. The impact sent a shockwave through the forest, the trees trembling as the two forces collided. The demon screamed, its form wavering, but it didn't retreat. It pressed forward, its claws slashing at me, its eyes burning with a hatred that was almost palpable. But I held my ground, the light within me growing stronger with every passing moment. And then, just as I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, the demon faltered, its form flickered, the shadows around it dissipating, and for a moment I saw something else, a flicker of fear in its hollow eyes. It was afraid of the light, afraid of me. And in that moment, I realized that I had the upper hand. I pressed forward, the light surging around me, driving the demon back. It snarled and hissed, its form flickering as it tried to resist, but it was no use. The light was too strong, too pure. And then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, the demon dissolved, its form collapsing into a cloud of shadow that was quickly consumed by the light. I stood there, breathing heavily, the golden glow slowly fading as the forest around me returned to normal. The twisted trees straightened, the oppressive darkness lifted, and the air grew warm and sweet once more. I had done it. I had faced the demon, faced myself, and come out on top. But as I stood there, basking in the glow of my victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The demon was gone, yes, but the forest was still there, vast and ancient and full of secrets. And somewhere, deep within its heart, I knew there were more shadows waiting, more demons to face. But for now I was safe. For now I had won. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and turned to leave the forest behind. But as I walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing, amber eyes watching me from the shadows. They weren't there, of course, but the feeling remained, a lingering sense of unease that followed me all the way home. Story 3. The first time I saw the cabin. It was through a veil of rain so thick it felt like the sky was trying to wash the world away. I had been driving for hours, lost on back roads that twisted and turned like serpents through the dense forest. My GPS had given up long ago, its screen flickering and dying with a final, pitiful beep. The storm had rolled in out of nowhere, turning the already dim afternoon into a twilight of gray and green. The trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches clawing at the sky, and the rain hammered down so hard I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. I was about to give up, to pull over and wait out the storm, when I saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the rain and the shadows. But as I drove closer, the light grew brighter, and I realized it was coming from a cabin. It was small and weathered, its wooden walls dark with age and moisture, but the glow from its windows was warm and inviting. I didn't think twice. I pulled off the road and parked my car, grabbing my bag and sprinting through the downpour to the cabin's front door. The door creaked open before I could knock, revealing a man standing in the doorway. He was tall and thin, with a face that seemed carved from the same wood as the cabin. His eyes were deep-set and shadowed, but they held a glimmer of something I couldn't quite place. Curiosity, maybe, or suspicion. He didn't say anything, just stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. I hesitated for a moment, my instinct screaming at me to turn back, to get in my car and drive away as fast as I could. But the rain was relentless, and the thought of spending the night in my car was too much to bear. So I stepped inside, dripping water onto the worn wooden floor, and the man closed the door behind me. The cabin was small but cozy, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a faint scent of pine in the air. The man motioned for me to sit in one of the chairs by the fire, and I did, grateful for the warmth. He disappeared into the kitchen, returning a moment later with the steaming mug of tea. I took it gratefully, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic and letting the heat seep into my bones. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to intrude, but the storm. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're not intruding," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "This cabin has a way of drawing people and when they need it most." I frowned, unsure of what to make of his words, but before I could ask, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the room. I sat there for a while, sipping my tea and staring into the fire, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The man's words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder what he had meant. What did he mean by drawing people in? And why did I feel like I wasn't the first lost traveler to find my way to this cabin? The storm raged on outside, the wind howling and the rain pounding against the windows. I told myself I would leave as soon as the weather cleared, but as the hours passed and the storm showed no signs of letting up, I began to wonder if I would be spending the night. The man hadn't returned, and the silence in the cabin was oppressive, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. I was just about to get up and look for him when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. It was soft, like the rustling of leaves or the whisper of fabric, but it sent a chill down my spine. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or the settling of the old cabin, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the shadows where the man had disappeared. The hallway was narrow and dark, the walls lined with old photographs and paintings that seemed to watch me as I passed. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from a door at the end of the hall. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, and for a moment I thought about turning back, but something compelled me to open the door, to see what was on the other side. I turned the knob slowly, the door creaking open to reveal a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with strange, unidentifiable objects. Jars of murky liquid, bundles of dried herbs, and what looked like bones. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a book. The book was old, its leather cover cracked and worn, and it seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. I stepped closer, my hand reaching out to touch it, but before I could, I heard a voice behind me. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, and saw the man standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were dark and intense, and I could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical force. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" The man didn't answer right away. He stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, and closed the door behind him. The air grew heavier, the shadows deeper, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. "This cabin," he said, his voice low and measured, "is a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. The book you were about to touch, it's not for the likes of you." I took a step back, my mind racing. "What do you mean? What kind of power?" The man's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "The kind that can't be explained. The kind that draws people in, like moths to a flame. You felt it, didn't you? The pull, the need to come here." I shook my head, tried to deny it, but deep down, I knew he was right. I had felt it, that inexplicable pull that had led me to this cabin. And now, standing here in this strange, shadowy room, I realized that I had walked into something far beyond my understanding. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're not the first to come here," he said, "and you won't be the last. But if you value your life, you'll leave now, before it's too late." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the look in his eyes stopped me cold. There was something ancient and dangerous in those eyes, something that made my blood run cold. I nodded slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and backed out of the room. The man followed me to the front door, his presence a silent, looming shadow at my back. I stepped out into the rain, the cold water soaking through my clothes in an instant, and turned to look at him one last time. "What happens to the others?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the storm. "The ones who don't leave." The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in their depths, something that made my stomach churn. "They become part of the cabin," he said simply. And then he closed the door, leaving me standing in the rain, alone and shivering. I didn't look back as I ran to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. The storm was still raging, the rain coming down in sheets, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from that cabin, away from the man and the shadows, and the book that pulsed with an otherworldly light. I drove for hours, the storm slowly easing as I put more and more distance between myself and the cabin. But even as the rain stopped and the clouds parted, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The man's words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder what he had meant. What did he mean by part of the cabin? And what would have happened if I had stayed? I didn't have any answers, and I knew I never would. But as I drove through the night, the forest stretching out on either side of the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was still out there waiting for the next lost traveler to stumble upon it, to feel its pull, to step inside and never leave. And as the mile stretched on, I realized that I would never truly be free of it. The cabin had marked me, just as it had marked all the others who had come before me. And no matter how far I drove, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that place, I knew it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to draw me back in. Because the cabin wasn't just a place. It was a presence, a force, a living, breathing thing, and it would never let me go. Story 4. The darkness outside pressed against the windows of my house like a living thing, a weight that grew heavier as the hours crept past. I sat alone in the silence, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the only reminder that life still existed in this bubble of eerie stillness. The lamp beside me cast a pool of warm light on the pages of the old journal I had found earlier in the attic. Its battered leather cover was scuffed and cracked with age, and the faint musty smell that clung to it filled the air around me as I turned the pages. At first, the words written inside seemed mundane, a catalog of someone's daily life, filled with observations about the weather, notes on errands, and occasional philosophical musings. But then the tone shifted, subtle at first, like the dissonance of a single off-key note in an otherwise harmonious melody. The entries began to speak of shadows that moved without explanation, whispers heard in the dead of night, and the growing certainty that the writer was being watched. The further I read, the more my heart began to pound. The meticulous handwriting grew jagged and erratic as the writer descended into paranoia. Or maybe it wasn't paranoia at all. They described an unrelenting presence, an entity that lingered in the periphery of their vision, vanishing whenever they turned to look. The descriptions became fragmented, a feverish struggle to convey something that words could not encapsulate. I began to feel a prickling at the back of my neck, as though the act of reading these entries had somehow summoned that same presence into my own home. The shadows cast by the flickering flame of the candle on the table seemed to stretch and shift in ways that defied logic. The distant creak of the old wooden floorboards sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was just the house settling, the kind of noise I had heard countless times before without giving it a second thought. I flipped to the final entry, and the jagged scrawl nearly leapt off the page. The writer claimed they had finally seen it, the thing that had been haunting them. They tried to describe it, but the words fell apart, descending into incoherence. The entry ended abruptly, and the remainder of the pages were blank. As I closed the journal and set it down on the table, I couldn't shake the feeling that something intangible had shifted around me, an invisible ripple disturbing the air. I glanced at the clock on the wall, the hands seeming to move slower than they should, as though time itself was growing sluggish. It was late, far later than I realized, but the idea of turning off the lights and going to bed felt impossible. The oppressive weight of the dark rooms beyond the reach of the lamp made my skin crawl. A faint tapping sound jolted me out of my thoughts. It came from the window behind me, an irregular rhythm that sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. For a moment, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My rational mind told me it must be a branch tapping against the glass in the wind. But as I slowly turned to face the source of the noise, my eyes were drawn to a faint silhouette just beyond the glass. It wasn't a vague outline of tree branches swaying in the breeze. It was the shape of a face, indistinct yet unmistakable. My heart thundered in my chest as I stared, unable to tear my eyes away. The face was there, yet it wasn't. It flickered in and out of focus, its features blurred as though seen through rippling water. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I rushed to the window, throwing open the curtains and peering out into the yard. The weak glow of the porch light illuminated the lawn, revealing nothing but empty space. The street beyond was deserted, the shadows undisturbed. As I stood there, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall behind me. My blood turned to ice, every hair on my body standing on end. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving closer with each passing moment. I spun around, my eyes straining to pierce the dimness of the hallway. But there was nothing there. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving behind an echoing silence that was somehow worse than the noise itself. I stumbled backward into the living room, grabbing the journal off the table as though it might somehow shield me from whatever was happening. My pulse raced as I began flipping through the pages, desperate for some kind of answer, some clue that might explain the nightmare unfolding around me. A noise broke through the suffocating silence, the distinct sound of breathing. It was deep and guttural, coming from just behind me. Slowly, I turned my head, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I was paralyzed by fear. My eyes met a pair of glowing orbs, like twin embers floating in the darkness. A hand, pale and skeletal, reached out toward me from the shadows. My instincts finally kicked in, and I bolted. The journal still clutched tightly in my hand. My feet carried me up the stairs, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of the impossibility of what I had just seen. I locked myself in the bedroom, pushing a heavy dresser against the door for good measure. For what felt like hours, I sat curled up in the corner of the room, staring at the door and listening for any sign of movement. The house had gone deathly silent, as though it, too, was holding its breath. When the first rays of dawn finally broke through the curtains, I let out a shuddering sigh of relief. Somehow, I had made it through the night, but the relief was short-lived. As I stood and approached the window, I noticed something etched into the glass, jagged symbols that hadn't been there before. The sight of them made my stomach drop, my mind recoiling at their alien geometry. In that moment, I knew the thing I had seen wasn't gone. It was still there, watching, waiting. And as the light of day grew brighter, I realized something else, something far worse. Its presence had somehow taken root in me. I could feel it, a dark and insidious weight coiling around my very soul. Now, as I sit here writing this down, trying to piece together the fragments of my shattered sanity, I can't shake the feeling that it's watching me even now. The shadows in the corners of the room seem to stretch and ripple, and the air feels thick, oppressive. The journal sits on the desk beside me, its empty pages a mocking reminder of all that remains unsaid. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I do know one thing. I can't escape it. No matter how far I run, no matter how brightly the sun shines, it will always be there, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. And one day, when I least expect it, it will reach out again. Days turned into nights, and nights blurred into days, but time lost all meaning in the wake of what I had experienced. The thing, whatever it was, had imprinted itself on my existence, like a parasite burrowing into the essence of who I was. At first, I tried to convince myself that the events of that night had been nothing more than the product of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. I clung desperately to the rational explanations I had always relied upon. Stress, I told myself. Sleep deprivation. A trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. The sense of being watched never left me. It was there in the dead of night, when the shadows in the corners of my room seemed impossibly deep, and it was there in broad daylight, when the sun's rays failed to chase away the lingering chill that settled in my bones. The presence was always there, just beyond the veil of perception, waiting. I stopped leaving the house. The outside world became a distant memory, a reality I could no longer afford to engage with. The walls of my home became both my refuge and my prison, enclosing me in a space that felt increasingly alien. The journal remained on the desk where I had left it, an ominous reminder of the door I had inadvertently opened. I couldn't bring myself to read it again, yet I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it either. It felt like a tether, a fragile connection to the truth that I was too afraid to confront. The symbols etched into the window remained, their jagged lines mocking me with their incomprehensibility. I had tried scrubbing them away, but no amount of effort could erase them. It was as though they had been burned into the glass, a permanent scar left by the entity that haunted me. The dreams were the worst. They came every night, vivid and oppressive, dragging me into a labyrinth of shifting corridors and impossible architecture. The walls would pulse like living flesh, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. In the dreams, I was never alone. The presence was there, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness, its skeletal hands reaching for me with a deliberate, almost leisurely pace. I would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, the echoes of its guttural breathing still reverberating in my ears. Sleep became a torment I could no longer endure, yet the exhaustion weighed on me like a leaden shroud. The boundary between waking and dreaming began to blur, and I started to see glimpses of the entity even when I was awake. It would flicker at the edge of my vision, a shadow that disappeared the moment I turned to look. My grip on reality was slipping, and I knew it. But what could I do? Who could I turn to? The idea of explaining my situation to someone else seemed laughable. They would dismiss me as delusional, or worse, they would lock me away in some sterile room where the presence would follow me, unrelenting. I was alone in this, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Or was it? The thought struck me one night as I sat in the darkened living room, the journal open before me. What if the entity wasn't confined to me alone? What if it had existed long before I found the journal, and would continue to exist long after I was gone? The thought was both comforting and horrifying. Comforting because it meant I wasn't the first to face this torment. Horrifying because it meant there might be no escape. I began to research, desperate for answers. I scoured old texts and obscure forums, searching for any mention of the symbols on the window or the descriptions of the entity that haunted me. My search yielded fragments of information, disjointed pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. There were mentions of an ancient presence, a malevolent force that preyed on those who stumbled upon its domain. Some called it a shadow of the abyss. Others referred to it as the Harbinger. The accounts were inconsistent, but one detail remained constant. Once marked by the entity, there was no way to rid oneself of it. The mark, it all came back to the mark. The symbols etched into my window were a binding, a claim of ownership that tied the entity to me. But what did it want? Why had it chosen me? The answers eluded me, and the weight of the unknown pressed down on me with unbearable force. The dreams grew worse, more vivid and more invasive. They began to bleed into my waking moments, the boundaries between reality and nightmare dissolving entirely. I would find myself standing in the kitchen, only to realize the walls around me had shifted, the familiar space transforming into the labyrinth from my dreams. The smell of decay would fill my nostrils, and I would hear the guttural breathing of the entity closing in on me. Then, with a blink, I would be back in the kitchen, the remnants of the dream fading like a receding tide. But the fear remained, a constant undercurrent that eroded my sanity. One night, as I sat at the desk with the journal before me, I made a decision. If I couldn't escape the entity, I would confront it. The thought filled me with dread, but it was the only way forward. I couldn't live like this, suspended in a state of perpetual terror. I began to write, pouring my thoughts onto the pages of the journal as though documenting my experiences might somehow give me power over them. I wrote about the presence, the dreams, the symbols, and the inexorable feeling of being watched. I wrote until my hand ached, the ink smudging as my trembling fingers struggled to hold the pen. And as I wrote, something strange happened. The room around me seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening until they consumed the light entirely. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing against me like an invisible force. And then it appeared. The entity stepped out of the darkness, its glowing eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a jolt of terror through my body. It was taller than I had imagined, its skeletal frame draped in tattered remnants of shadow that seemed to writhe and pulse like living things. It didn't speak, but its presence conveyed a sense of purpose, a malevolence so profound that it seemed to vibrate in the very air around me. My instinct screamed at me to run, to flee from the monstrosity that stood before me. But I remained frozen in place, my gaze locked with its. The journal lay open on the desk, the pages filled with my desperate writings. I realized then that it had been a mistake to document my experiences. The act of writing had given the entity a foothold in my reality, a bridge between its world and mine. As it reached for me with its skeletal hand, I felt a surge of defiance rise within me. I wasn't going to let it claim me without a fight. I grabbed the journal and held it out like a shield, the absurdity of the gesture lost in the heat of the moment. The entity recoiled, its glowing eyes narrowing as though in pain. The symbols on the window began to glow, the jagged lines pulsating with an eerie light. I didn't understand what was happening, but I seized the opportunity. With a burst of adrenaline, I hurled the journal across the room. It struck the window with a force that shattered the glass, the symbols erupting into a blinding light that consumed the entity in its entirety. When the light faded, I found myself alone in the room, the remnants of the shattered window scattered across the floor. The journal was gone, and with it, the oppressive weight that had haunted me. But the relief was short-lived. Deep down, I knew the entity wasn't truly gone. It had merely retreated, waiting for the next opportunity to cross into our world. The mark remained, etched into my very being, a constant reminder of the door I had opened and the horrors that awaited beyond it. And as I sit here now, writing these final words, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching, its glowing eyes lurking just beyond the edge of perception. Story 4. Something scary happened to me in the woods when I was a kid, so I'm letting you guys know what it is. When I was a young teen, there was a small forest fairly near our house. My neighbor and I would walk to it frequently and go build dens and play on the park near its edge. The land was clearly once part of an estate because it had an old 1900s looking swimming pool and bits of a stone path dotted amidst the undergrowth. We'd sometimes take kids there and play chase games or pretend to be tribespeople sprinting through the thick foliage. It was a fun place to explore, especially after we made a very interesting discovery of some rather risky magazines that all teen boys crave. They looked like they were from the 70s. Anyway, we've been going there for about a year or so on weekends when we finally decided to take a big pair of garden shears and start clearing the area for our biggest den yet. We chose part of the forest that had always been blocked off to us because it was mostly surrounded by a thick wall of bamboo overgrown from the place's time as an estate. The forest was a paradise just for us. We'd never ever seen anyone there other than us or the people we brought. The magazines and our dens were always exactly as we left them, but all the same, we figured cutting a secret way into the bamboo wall area would give us the best protected den from strangers, barbarians, and ninjas. It took us most of the day to cut our way in. When we made an arch to crawl through, we went in and found that we were in a clearing with only clovers growing in it, no taller plants at all, just a soft blanket of clovers. Dotted throughout were odd little knee-high statues of fairies sitting on stone mushrooms, playing harps and other instruments. Every single one of them had its face smashed off. In the center of the cramped clearing was a giant concrete-looking block. We kicked over one of the fairy statues on the way over to it, probably to demonstrate that we weren't scared. It was a giant rough stone coffin. Some ivy-like plant covered most of it, but clearly had a well-defined lid and a worn, unreadable inscription on the side. Adrenaline-fueled curiosity took over, and we tried with all our might to lift the lid, but it must have weighed tons. The adrenaline wore off. We freaked out and hurriedly walked back through the play park where we sat and discussed our find for a bit. We decided the clearing was too perfect to pass up, so the next day we returned with some old metal sheeting and plywood boards to build our shelter. It wasn't raining, but the day was heavily dark and overcast, so the woods were about as dark as they could be during the day. We got back into the clearing, started building, and got pretty far with it. After a little while, my friend sort of yelped out, "Oh Christ!" I turned to see him, stood next to the coffin. It's giving me shivers just thinking about this. It was open. The lid was slid off to one side, just enough that a thin person could get through the gap. I ran over, stared into the gap, and saw nothing but pitch dark. I whispered, "Run." The wind rose, and it started raining, so there was noise everywhere right at that moment. I've never experienced anything like it. We ran through the woods faster than we'd ever practiced in our tribe games, and we never ever returned. Anyway, we went back earlier today, and everything was totally overgrown. As I'm seeing it now, I'm 6 feet 5 inches, and it's harder to move around. We did manage to find some of the landmarks, but every path I remember leading to or near the clover clearing was now gone. We spent a few hours getting lost in there, try to find ways around the back of it, but unfortunately, it looks like it's gone until some new kids cut their way in. Oh, and of course, the magazines had long since dissolved away. No vampires, I'm afraid. But I'm going to tell you that it was creepy, particularly the way the clearing seemed inaccessible, and the fact that the coffin seems to have sprung out of nowhere. This is truly the scariest, most horrible thing that's ever happened to me. I have never been so petrified in my life. To this day, I still do not know who this man was, what he was trying to do, or if he still is where I saw him. I was back home for the summer for the first time in a year after starting uni. Our home was and still is just outside of a small town with forests all around it. There was also a small man-made lake, which was diverted from a river that ran for miles through the forest and ramified into a few streams. East of the lake, near my home, there was a small grassy path that led to the river, following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I used to go on often as a child. I knew the forest there well. I knew where I could cut through dense trees to meet the stream. The walk I would always go on led me off the path, which turned northwest slowly, so away from the stream, and then took a sharp turn to the west after a few miles' walk, at which point the stream was quite hidden deep in the forest. I'd continue to walk north and follow the stream through the forest to get to the river, then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in this forest because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water. It goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spent many days wandering around there alone, or with my dad over the span of 18 years. Never saw anyone else in the forest. I went there twice that summer, both times alone. The first time, I left in the morning. I walked along the path away from the stream to the sharp bend, then cut back into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so. As I was running my hands in the water, I heard a bell from far away, coming from the north. Someone was making a bell ring fervently in periodic intervals, which I found strange. I listened well, wondering if it was some kind of lost hunting dog, and started moving towards the sound. Yes, I know I'd be the first person to perish in a horror movie, but that's the way I was heading anyway. I realized it couldn't have been an animal. I could tell the bell was too heavy because of how clear the sound was to be on a collar. I kept moving, and the bell was moving away from me and stopped completely after 5 minutes. The stream wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry a bell that could have been enclosed in a tin or something, and the river was too far still. I thought of everything, but nothing explained the sound apart from one obvious thing, which I didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew it had to be a person, and I stopped thinking about it and just walked on normally until I found a badger, a blue and dead one, carefully decapitated. It had obviously been done with a knife. It was fairly fresh. The body was still limp, and there wasn't too much smell coming from it. The wound was full of maggots, but I knew that happened soon after exposure. The sound of the bell had been following the stream. So had I. So the badger was put there, maybe killed there, at least decapitated while I was walking that way. I suppose I'm not sure, really. Nothing else happened that day. 1 week later, I went back for the second time that summer, and the last time ever. I left home at around 6 p.m. and made it to the stream, then walked to the river in an hour, and decided to go back the way I came because it was getting late, and it was raining quite heavily. The sunset was around 9 p.m., and I was walking as fast as I could. The sound of the rain in the trees was surreal and loud. I was somewhat trotting with my head down for a while through the clearest and most open part of the forest when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickly. It was the decomposing body of the badger, with its head strung to its front paws. That area looked like a ham because of the way it was tied, just swinging from a tree like an almost literal load of bollocks. It was at this putrid bag of stench, wet and dripping green liquid, that I started to gag. I had some sort of mucus-textured fluid in my hair. It was repulsive. At first, I just stared at it, slightly gobsmacked. Then I started fidgeting violently because I felt like I was drenched in its juices. I was soaking from the rain, and my senses became confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized I walked the same way to get to the river, so someone had strung up the body after I'd passed it on the way there. Someone knew I'd see it. So was someone watching me and running around the forest with the faint sounds of branches breaking around me, not animals. I looked around and started jogging. I was half running, half walking away from the stream back towards the path for a while when I heard the bell again. I proceeded to call my dad. I told him to meet me on the path where it turns west. It was the closest part of the path to me, and to go as fast as it could, and that someone was in the forest. I can't explain the feeling I had. It was like I just crapped out my intestines and stomach. I literally felt the hairs on my neck raise despite being soaked. It was dark. I jogged as fast as I could. I was panicking because the path was still just a bit far away, just too far to feel safe. It was still raining. Every single sound was muffled. I felt like everything was further away than ever before. The bell went on for way longer than the last time, on and off. I felt like it was surrounding me. At one point, the fear combined with my compromised hearing and the fact that I couldn't breathe properly was making me lose my sense of direction. I was automatically heading south-southwest, but I wasn't really sure what I was even doing. I was breathing like a horse, coughing my lungs up, kind of crying out loud like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot. I stayed on the phone with my mom, who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing sounds, but I wasn't sure what they were. My mom was screaming at the phone at the same time that they were on the path, and I needed to run, and that my dad had gotten out and was heading east from the path bend. I was terrified, so I went into survival mode. I was doing the half-run, half-speed walk thing again as I was out of breath. Then I heard branches break, clear footsteps, and for the first time, from down the forest, the bell rang louder. I didn't want to look over my shoulder. That's when I saw what was in the forest with me. A tall figure creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing the bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me now. Why? I don't know. If I had a hidden secret sprinting ability or instinctual adrenaline-induced superhuman powers. But when I tell you I ran for my life, I didn't look back once. I screamed as much as I could. I lied. I'm on the phone with the police. They're on the path. Dad, I can see you. I'm here. I wanted to yell, Dad, please, where are you? But I kept that to myself. I felt like something awful was going to happen. I felt like the man was right behind me, and I kept telling myself not to look back. I was gasping, wheezing, crying so loud, and screaming for my dad. I felt shivers on my neck, and then I switched off. I ran. I even dropped my bag, and only realized I didn't have it anymore when I was in the car. I felt like my phone was my only way home. Things no longer felt real. It was like my legs were moving by themselves. I didn't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart beating in my ears and the bell. I finally heard my dad shout my name, and I knew he was coming my way and that he could see me because of the intonation of his voice. I pretty much lunged myself at him when we got to each other. My dad heard the bell too. My mom could hear it on the phone, and she was waiting with the car ready to leave fast. We went directly to the police station, and I got medical attention soon after. My dad burst into tears in the car. He said he could hear the bell and thought he wouldn't have been able to see me, and asked, what if I didn't have my phone? What if he hadn't have picked up? They were almost as terrified as me because they witnessed everything through the call. They could hear me trying to run, and they could hear the danger. They just couldn't see it. The police couldn't really do much. They searched the area, and the only thing they found was a folded t-shirt placed under a rock. I didn't really question that, and my bag was not recovered. They said it was probably some homeless man living in the forest, but failed to realize what could have happened if my dad didn't know that part of the forest like I did, and where to find me. I'm not blaming anyone. The entire thing was my fault. There were just too many what-ifs. I want to believe it was just someone who decided to live in the woods and hunt or something. Maybe they were a bit mentally unstable and felt angry that I came into their territory. But what if it was more insidious? The way he moved towards me was abnormal. It was perverse because of how slowly he was ringing the bell. It was like he had trapped me. I didn't see any more detail. I just ran. To this day, I can't go anywhere where I'll be alone, and the sound of bells is a real problem. The smell of moss as well. Anyway, my parents and Steve Jobs saved my life. So go hug yours now and take decapitated badgers and bells as pagan signs that you're unwelcome. The story I would like to share is one that's been passed down to me from my late grandfather. The circumstances are so unusual, so unlike anything I've ever heard, that it's been in the back of my mind for nearly 20 years, ever since it was first told to me when I was a child. My granddad was a great talker and storyteller in his own way, and my family agrees that he wouldn't mind if I shared it with others. First, I'll need to give you a little background. My granddad was born in the early 1920s in a dirt floor, two-room farmhouse in rural South Carolina. An only child of a sharecropper during the Great Depression, he was a premature baby, and his parents, having already lost one infant, were understandably protective of him. I'm sure they were relieved and very happy that he was a strong and healthy child, albeit with an incredible amount of wanderlust, restless and energetic. He almost always finished his chores as quickly as he could so that he could take up his little fishing rod and roam to his heart's content. Back then, even horse carts were a rarity on those long-gone dirt roads. Cars were practically unheard of in that part of the country in those days. Disliking horses, but still greatly desiring to put as much distance between home and himself as he could in the span of an afternoon, my granddad had little choice other than to walk. And walk he did. He combed through miles of woods, fields, and swamplands barefoot, as the day he came into the world, heedless of brambles or snakes. They wouldn't bother him if he didn't bother them, as much as he enjoyed it. It was a lonely business. His father was a haleman, but with acres of land to help tend as well as livestock, he hardly had time to join his son on his walks. Sometimes one of the local boys would go with him, but it wasn't often. So, being practically kin to everyone within a 30-mile radius, my granddad took up on the grand old southern tradition of going visiting. One of his favorite places to go was to Uncle Peter's. Uncle Peter lived on one of the branches of the lake that stretched across a goodly portion of the country. It was a tiny shack, hardly more than a shanty, and barely big enough to fit both him and his spinster sister, Henrietta. But they made do. Uncle Peter loved to talk about as much as he loved to fish, so when he would spot my granddad coming up the dirt track towards the house, he'd put whatever he was working on aside. Aunt Henrietta was prone to giving him the stink eye for this, but she was fond of my granddad too, so she never said anything. It became a tradition of sorts for my grandfather to put a spare shirt in a sack, along with a treat of some kind that his mother made, and head off for Uncle Peter's every other weekend. He did this for years, right up until he married my grandmother. Usually, it was about dark when he'd set off, meaning it was well after sunset before he got there. The distance between his house and Uncle Peter's being, in the reckoning of about 6 or 7 miles. Granddad tended to stay through Sunday, heading home after evening supper, which tended to be on the table well after dark. Suffice to say, there wasn't much to be afraid of back then other than the local wildlife, and as I said before, as long as you minded your own business, They minded theirs. He'd been walking through the countryside at night all his life. He was comfortable and felt very safe. As it became habit through the years, Granddad kissed Aunt Henrietta goodbye, shook Uncle Peter's hand, and started home at a brisk pace. It was autumn, so the air was pleasantly cool, a warm relief from summer's oppressively humid heat. He said that there was a full moon that night, and when he would walk out in the open, it was fairly well lit. He could easily see where he was going. The dirt track that led away from Uncle Peter's shack meandered through a bit of marshland before it ended at a wider road. Usually, he didn't take that route unless he felt like a bit of a wander, since cutting through the fields and woodlands was a straight shot back to his parents' farmhouse, and the road slithered and slunk its way around the far side of the lake before curving back in the direction of home. That night, however, with the moonlight and the refreshing nip in the air, Granddad felt the urge to do a bit of meandering. Turning at the end of the path, he stepped onto the road, barefoot as a jaybird, and softly whistling to himself. The route was so familiar that he hardly paid any attention to the surroundings, letting his feet do most of the work while he occupied himself with other thoughts. Before he knew it, he was approaching the lake. The water was calm that night, dark but still. He slowed down a little, wanting to watch the way the light rippled and shimmered gently. It was such a pretty sight that he nearly missed what was standing not far up the road. At first, it was just a silhouette, a tall and solid-looking shadow that seemed to be facing the water. Granddad thought it might have been a trick of the light initially. He'd walked through a cemetery once in the middle of the night and thought he'd seen a soldier riding a white horse until he'd gotten closer and realized it was just a large dewdrop spiderweb. As he grew closer, he quickly realized it wasn't his eyes. There was something standing on the side of the road. In fact, it was a man. He could tell by the build, broad-shouldered and narrow at the hip, and he could tell by the clothes. Even in the moonlight, it was evident that the man wore a dark suit that did not fit him well. A shapeless hat was on his head, causing his form to appear elongated and oddly looking from the distance of several feet. Granddad could see the shine of good shoes, polished until they'd picked up the water's gleam. The man was standing close to the water, so close, in fact, that the waves were lapping at his expensive-looking shoes. The lake's shifting reflection softly illuminated his face, and Granddad could make out the strong features that had been weathered with time and toil. The lines around his mouth and eyes were distinctive as he smiled. That was when Granddad realized that the man was smiling at him. In fact, the man had been staring at him just as long, or longer, as Granddad had been doing the same. Quickly remembering his manners, he greeted the man politely. The man's expression didn't change, and his head turned to follow my granddaddy's movement as he stopped on the other side of the road. A little unnerved, my grandfather stood awkwardly for a long moment, waiting for what he thought would be the appropriate amount of time for a reply. The man didn't speak. His face never changed, but he slowly brought his hand up and made a beckoning motion with his fingers, silently asking my granddad to come closer. Granddad shook his head. "No, sir, I can't stay and talk. I've got to get home. You have a nice night." Dipping his head, my granddad started edging walking again, passing the strange man with a slightly quicker pace than he'd been walking before. Feeling that he was being watched, he stopped again a little further up the road. He turned to look back at the man to see he had turned around, so that he was now facing the direction that my granddad was going, still staring at him, but now waist-deep in the water. Confused and shocked, Granddad could only gape at the man as he stood in the lake, that same grin on his face as he lifted his hand and beckoned again. Shaking his head quickly, my granddad repeated what he'd said before. The words were out of his mouth before he could think about how weird they sounded now. "No, sir, I can't stay and talk. I've got to get home. You have a nice night." He whipped around and started walking even faster up the road, listening for the sound of splashing or footsteps behind him. But there was nothing, and that was when it struck him. He'd never heard a sound. No splash, no drip, no scuffle of shoes against dirt. Silence, closing in on the trees. He felt a shiver run down his back as the feeling of being watched washed over him. He froze on the spot. Everything in him was telling him to just keep walking and not stop until he was through his mother's kitchen door. But there was an even stronger urge to turn around, to look back one more time. The compulsion was too much to resist. He turned again to look at the lake. The man was still there, only now he was further in. The water was up to his shoulders now, and he was still smiling, even from the distance of several yards in the dark. Granddad somehow knew the man was still smiling. There was movement, and he saw the man lift his hand a third time, motioning for him to come back, to come closer, to come into the water. Granddad wasn't sure which, or even if it was any of those things, and he never found out. Without a word, he turned to face the trees and walked away. He walked the 7 miles home, unnerved and perplexed, and for the next 80 years, until his death at the age of 91, he never figured out who the man was, why he was there, or what he wanted. Over and over again, he told us that story. The encounter clearly haunted him. It haunts me. I shudder to think what would have happened had my granddad actually gotten close to the man or lingered by the lake that night. But the one thing that has stuck out in my mind about his experience more than anything is that the man stood almost neck-deep in water and didn't even make a ripple. Story 5. I never should have gone into that forest. People warned me about it. Old stories, whispers passed down from generation to generation, tales meant to keep children from wandering too far from home. They called it the Hollow Woods, a place where the trees swallowed the sunlight, where the air was too still, where travelers entered and never returned. I laughed at those stories. I thought they were just legends, the kind of things small towns clung to in order to keep a sense of mystery alive. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. It started with a dare. My friends and I had been drinking, sitting around the fire at the edge of town, talking about the things we'd never had the courage to do. Someone brought up the Hollow Woods, and the conversation shifted. One by one, they all made excuses, brushing it off with nervous chuckles. But I wasn't afraid, or at least, I pretended not to be. So I stood up, tossed my empty bottle into the fire, and announced that I would go in, just for an hour, just long enough to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. The first thing I noticed as I stepped beneath the canopy was the silence. The wind stopped. The leaves, which had been rustling only moments before, were still. No birds, no crickets, no distant hum of traffic. Just silence, thick and heavy, pressing against my ears. My breath felt too loud. My heartbeat thudded against my ribs. But I pushed forward, forcing myself to ignore the creeping sense of unease curling around my spine. The trees were ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their bark peeling away like dead flesh. The further I walked, the darker it became. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. No surprise there. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick shadows, illuminating the narrow path ahead. The deeper I went, the more the air thickened, like I was moving through water instead of air. The smell of damp earth and rotting wood clung to my nostrils. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the stories had gotten to me more than I realized. But then I saw it, a figure, standing between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. Tall, too tall. Its limbs were impossibly long, its body stretched and unnatural. My breath caught in my throat, my flashlight trembling in my grip as I aimed the beam toward it. But there was nothing there. Just trees, just shadows, my mind playing tricks on me. I let out a shaky breath and laughed under my breath, shaking my head at my own paranoia. I needed to keep moving. I had to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid. I don't know how long I walked. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to shift around me. The trees no longer looked familiar. The path twisted in ways that didn't make sense. I turned back, convinced I had walked far enough, only to find that the way I had come was gone. Panic tightened my chest. I spun around, trying to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. I was lost. No, not lost, trapped. The silence deepened, pressing into my skull, filling my ears with a soundless pressure that made my head pound. Then the whispering started. Low, just beneath the range of hearing. Words I couldn't quite make out. My flashlight flickered. My hands were sweating. I turned in circles, the beam of light shaking as I searched for the source. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices, urgent and desperate. And then laughter. Cold, hollow laughter, echoing through the trees. A shadow moved at the corner of my eye. My breath hitched, my pulse hammering as I turned the light toward it. This time, I saw it clearly. A face, pale and stretched, grinning with too many teeth, eyes like empty sockets staring right at me. My legs locked, terror freezing me in place. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching, grinning, waiting. Then, it took a step toward me. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just ran. Branches slashed at my arms. My legs burned with the effort. My lungs screamed for air. The whispering turned into shrieks, wailing voices surrounding me, closing in. The ground shifted beneath my feet, the roots twisting like fingers grasping at my ankles. I stumbled, hit the ground hard, my flashlight skidding away, its beam landing on something ahead of me. A clearing, a circle of trees, their trunks split open like gaping mouths, their bark slick with something dark, and in the center, a figure stood, tall, hollow, a void in the shape of a man, its limbs stretched, its fingers ending in jagged points, its head tilted, as if curious, as if amused by my terror. The whispering came from it, pouring out of its empty mouth, voices of those who had come before me, those who had never left. I scrambled backward, my breath ragged, my body shaking. The figure took a step forward, then another. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My mind raced for a way out, for anything, but there was nothing. I was going to die here. I was going to become one of the voices. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling into darkness, my body hitting something cold, wet, water. I gasped, choking as I surfaced, the icy liquid shocking me back to reality. I flailed, kicking toward the edge, dragging myself onto solid ground. My head spun, my vision blurred. When I looked up, the clearing was gone. The trees were normal again. The figure was nowhere in sight. I didn't question it. I didn't stop. I ran. I ran until I saw the first glimpse of dawn breaking through the branches, until I stumbled out onto the road, until I collapsed, gasping, shaking alive, but not untouched. I made it out, but I brought something with me. The whispering never stopped. It lingers at the edge of my hearing, just beyond my reach, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see it, standing at the foot of my bed, watching, waiting. I never should have gone into that forest, but now the forest is inside me. I never should have gone into that forest, but now the forest is inside me. The whispering never stopped. At first, I convinced myself it was just in my head. Trauma, I told myself. A trick of the mind after what I had been through. But deep down, I knew better. The voices were real. They spoke in hushed, rasping tones, just beneath the surface of my hearing, like a forgotten radio station bleeding through the static. No matter where I went, they followed. Soft at first, like a breeze through dead leaves. Then stronger, insistent. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. That thing, that figure, tall and stretched beyond reason, grinning with that sickening mouth of too many teeth. At first, it was only in my dreams. Then, I started seeing it in the corners of my vision, just for a split second before it vanished. In the mirror, in the reflection of my phone screen, at the foot of my bed when I jolted awake in the dead of night, gasping for air, drenched in cold sweat. I tried telling myself it wasn't real, but the scratches on my arms told a different story. The first morning I noticed them, I stared at the red marks trailing down my forearms, as if something had been clawing at me in my sleep. Maybe I did it to myself, I thought. Maybe I was thrashing in my nightmares. I covered them with long sleeves and forced myself to go about my day. But the next night, they came back. Worse, deeper, and then the bruises started appearing. Finger-shaped imprints around my wrists and ankles, as if something was grabbing me, holding me down. I stopped going to work. I stopped answering my friends' messages. How could I explain any of this? No one would believe me. Hell, I wouldn't have believed me. The walls of my apartment started to feel like they were closing in. The whispering turned into chanting, the voices growing clearer. They called my name, beckoning, begging. I couldn't stay there anymore. So I did something stupid. I went back to the hollow woods. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I thought I could end it. Maybe I thought if I faced it again, I could make it stop. Maybe I was just desperate. But the moment I stepped beneath that cursed canopy, the air grew thick and stagnant, pressing down on me like a weight. The wind died. The world fell silent. And then the laughter started. Low and guttural at first, echoing between the trees. Then it split into multiple voices, a chorus of shrieks and giggles, overlapping and chaotic. My breath hitched in my throat. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles turning white. Something moved in the trees. A shape. No, several shapes, darting between the trunks, too fast to focus on, too dark to make out. But they were there, surrounding me, watching, waiting. I turned, trying to track them, but they moved like shadows, slipping between the gaps in my vision. The chanting grew louder, and the trees shifted. They were no longer just trees. They had faces, hollow, gaping mouths twisted in agony, empty eyes watching me, bark peeling away like rotting flesh. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong, like it was breathing. And then I saw it, the figure, standing just ahead of me, in the same clearing as before, taller than before, darker, its grin wider, stretching beyond the limits of its face. The whispering stopped. The world held its breath. It raised one hand and pointed at me. Something yanked my legs out from under me. I hit the ground hard, my flashlight flying from my grasp. The moment the light vanished, the darkness swallowed me whole. I felt them, hands, grasping, clawing, pulling me down, cold fingers wrapping around my arms, my legs, my throat. The ground beneath me split open, and I fell into nothingness. And then I woke up, in my bed, in my apartment. The morning sunlight filtered through my window, the birds chirping outside like nothing had happened. My heart pounded against my ribs as I sat up, gasping for air. My hands were shaking. My body ached, as if I had been running for miles. My mind struggled to grasp what had just happened. Was it real? A dream? A hallucination? But then I saw it. The dirt beneath my fingernails, the scratches on my arms, the bruises around my wrists, and the footprints. Dirted, inhuman footprints, leading from the foot of my bed to my closet. I wasn't alone. I was never alone. And I knew, without a doubt, that I had brought something back with me. Story 6. The house was a legend passed down from class to class in my high school. Over the decades, students and even teachers told a variation of the story about a house that belonged to one of the earliest families in our community in central Pennsylvania. It had burnt down a century earlier, but reappeared with the first full moon in October. The story was based on a real house that belonged to a family which owned much of the land in the country, but sold it off for residential and commercial development over the decades. When the house burned down in the 1950s, it took with it the last of the Hester family line. The problem was that no one knew where the house had been. There were some old foundations along the southern slopes of Peters Mountain, but none of them could be linked historically to such a house. The only history was that of the suburban legend, which evolved over the years. The one thing that remained constant was the promise of a treasure hidden under the floorboards in the house. If you found the house while it existed in our realm, you might find cash, gold, and jewels, enough to make you rich. Of course. But if you didn't get out of the house before it vanished, you would vanish along with it and be destined to haunt its walls forever. Of course, this was the excuse used by high school kids over the years to go into the woods up on Peters Mountain to camp, have bonfires, or really to try and find the house. In the 1980s, it was still a time when parents didn't mind their kids being gone overnight, and none of us had cell phones. Overnight games of Dungeons and Dragons were common on weekends, and my gaming group was led by a kid who lived at the base of Peters Mountain. He and his brothers loved the story of Hester's house, and as October approached that one year, he took a break to persuade us to leave our tabletop adventure and go on a real one. We were a group of 6 boys, aged 16 to 17, and it was easy for us to tell our parents we were staying over at Cliff's house for a marathon weekend of D&D. Instead, we gathered camping material, and agreed to head up the mountain to a small campsite Cliff knew. The full moon rose over the mountain as we searched for the Hester house. Of the 6 of us, we lost the 16-year-old for lack of permission. We lost 2 more who chickened out, so there were 3 of us who remained. They had to split the gear, which put us behind schedule for the camp. The woods were damp, and leaves were already falling across the trail, making the shallow uphill slippery and the steeper climbs treacherous. Getting up in the daylight was going to be fine, but after dark, there would be 2 miles between camp and Cliff's home, and another 3 miles back to town. So we were committed. We reached the clearing where Cliff and his brothers, and a lot of Hester's house seekers, made camp. It was a relatively flat area with a view down to the mountain and the trees, but we were totally insulated by trees and cut off from the world by the sound of the forest, with only the regular whistle of a distant tree train to cut through it. By the time we reached this camp, we had lost a half hour and scrambled to assemble dry firewood, start a fire, and get the tent pitched. The wind rose out from the west and cut through the trees, making our activities difficult. From there, things started to fall apart. There were poles missing from the tent bag. We could only find a limited supply of dry firewood to get the camp started. The wind freshened, and darkness swept over us as the sun set behind the mountaintop, and clouds approached from that direction. The temperature plummeted from the mid-50s, while we worked up a sweat to the low 40s with the chilling breeze. Cliff and I struggled to improvise solutions for the tent, using branches to prop out walls and tying others to trees with nylon rope. Meanwhile, Keith fumbled and stumbled, trying to get the fire lit, resorting to lighting an entire box of matches under the kindling in a gamble to get the fire lit and hot enough to dry out the moist firewood. We knew that any significant rain was going to put it out, and we would be huddled together in our sleeping bags and a ragged tent all night. We abandoned the idea of searching for Hester's house and prepared to weather a storm. Once we established some kind of camp, the rain held off for a while, just bringing a cold drizzle. We took turns maintaining the fire and threw shade at one another for not checking the equipment or planning the weather and generally being miserable. As the light faded, we heard movement in the woods around us. Definitely human footfalls through the leaves and underbrush. It cut through the sound of dried leaves rustling and falling from the whistling wind through the trees and the updraft that blasted up the side of the mountain. Suddenly, a big object landed right in the middle of the campfire, throwing hot embers and burning twigs in every direction, including our tents. The evening brightened in a dance of fireflies over the fire, and we stepped out to find out what happened. Did a limb fall? Was it a wet branch popping with boiling water pockets? It was a rock, the size of a basketball. Cliff pointed out to the dark figure standing on the trees on the far side of the fire. It was a tall, husky figure standing slightly hunched, like he was getting ready to charge or run away. Movement through the woods resumed, and we detected 3 other people about 50 feet up and down the mountain around the campsite. The first figure we saw stood motionless for moments. Cliff yelled, more ticked off than afraid. "Who are you guys? Don't mess with the fire." The first figure started laughing. It wasn't another kid. It was old or raspy, and that was joined by other older-sounding voices and laughter. A softball-sized rock struck a tree trunk over my head and bounced off to one side. Another sailed over Keith's head and struck the tent, snapping the branch holding up one side. We scattered. I don't know what the others were thinking, but I wanted to keep trees between me and as many of them as I could. The laughter intensified, and more rocks landed in the campsite. I slipped in the wet leaves and slid down towards one of the men as he rushed forward towards me. Arms out, he was wide and slow, juggling as he advanced and laughing like it was the funniest thing he'd done all year. He slipped and face-planted in the muddy ground. By that time, I had traction and was heading back up the slope towards camp. I took a small rock to the shoulder, but it glanced off my padded shoulder, and I kept moving. I got to the camp, and one of the men was standing in front of the fire, his features in shadow. He pointed at me and roared, "Leave Hester's house alone." He then took a couple of burning logs and tossed them into the tent. He ran off, chased by the others in the same general direction. Cliff and Keith rushed back. The tent was a loss. We had to smother it, and it began to rain. A wall of rain rushed in from the west, and it poured so hard that it poured out the fires and left us in darkness. We huddled together to be able to talk over the rain. Are they gone? Where'd they go? What do we do? We had flashlights, and while cold and soaked, we were uninjured. We got to get out of here. We heard footsteps in the darkness, and a single beam of light shot out from the forest over us. The voice from before screamed, "Leave the Hester house alone. Get out of here, or we will end you." We abandoned our gear except our flashlights, and Keith led us away from the sight down the mountain. We were moving at half the speed coming up. It was sloppy and slippery, and the rain was relentless. We slid on our butts over the steep parts and had to stop to work out a way down that wouldn't risk breaking our legs or necks. Every time we stopped, a rock would sail down between us and snap against other rocks or a tree, and a voice would shriek, "Go, or we'll bury you on this mountain." A rock hit Keith on the cheek and nearly sent him over an incline, but he dropped to his knees to keep from rolling. It dazed him, but his adrenaline kept him moving as the skin swelled and darkened. I said the first thing I thought of to Cliff, "If these guys are your brothers and their friends, I will be so pissed." But Cliff shook his head. "Not them. They'd never do this." And I believed him. But most of the town, dating back a generation or more, did know about Hester's house story and the date. It would be easy for someone with bad intentions to come out into the woods on the first full moon and wait for a bunch of stupid, unprepared kids to make camp far from wilderness. Suddenly, the stories about kids going missing inside the Hester house, trying to get treasure, made me think. If anyone actually did go missing on a dark night in the woods, and the house was just a cover-up story, a rock hit me between the shoulder blades with the power of a fastball, and I felt something pop in my spine, and a sharp shock up and down my entire body. After what felt like hours in the increasing darkness, dry heaving from the panic and the struggle, coughing and spitting up snot and rainwater, we came to the road closest to Cliff's house. There was a man standing under the streetlight by the street. He had the same predatory hunch as the man at the campsite. Soon, 3 or 4 other figures appeared and blocked our path. We stopped, and they began moving towards us. Suddenly, our silent prayers were answered when a truck rolled around the corner, heading up the hill and bathing them in its headlights, blinding them. These were not kids nor young adults. They were older men, faces in their 50s or 60s, bloated and wrinkled, covered in dirty clothes and windbreakers. They were ugly, evil men who had worn us down to exhaustion and were ready to strike. The truck did not slow down, but it gave us a break. Cliff pulled us onto one side of the path and back into the woods along a similar natural path along the road. With a supernatural reserve of strength, we cut through the barbs and brushes like rabbits eluding wolves and came out scratched and scraped across the street from Cliff's house. The porch light was lit, and the garage door was wide open. Cliff's dad was working on something in the garage. We heard the men chasing us along the road, but once they saw the lights of the house, they stopped. We didn't stop until we were in the garage, yelling to Cliff's dad that there were bad men after us. Cliff's dad called the cops. Cliff's mom took us inside, dried us off, and helped tend our injuries. The cops never found anyone, but they scolded us for being irresponsible enough to go camping in the woods without supervision or preparation. The sergeant there saved his strongest words for Cliff's parents, effectively ending our weekend D&D games. Prevailing wisdom was that it was probably some older guys who lived on the mountain who just wanted to scare some kids out on Hester's house night, and they dismissed our dramatic interpretation of the peril, which was, in their mind, the product of our excitement and hormones. The newspapers took a decidedly Halloween approach to the story, spinning it as a tantalizing tale of transients stalking local kids on a camping trip with God knows what in mind when they caught us. But weird Hester's house guardians in the woods? It's been 30 years, but if I'm ever in the neighborhood again, I hope we never meet, because I'll straight up end you. Story 7. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows, where the slivers of moonlight barely pierced through the thick canopy above. The trees seemed alive, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. whispering secrets carried by the cold, damp wind. I had no intention of being here, not at this hour, not under these circumstances. But when my sister disappeared 2 days ago, leaving nothing but her flashlight flickering faintly near the edge of these woods, I knew there was no other choice. The authorities had given up too quickly, dismissing her absence as a case of a lost hiker who would eventually turn up. But I knew my sister. She knew these woods like the back of her hand, having roamed them since we were kids. Something had happened to her, something the rational mind couldn't easily explain. And so, armed with nothing but a sense of desperation and a backpack of supplies, I ventured into the forest she had vanished into, the weight of dread pressing against my chest. The deeper I went, the more unnatural the forest became. The air itself seemed heavier, denser, as though it resisted being inhaled. The trees, towering monoliths of bark and moss, stood unnervingly close to one another, their roots snaking across the ground like the talons of some subterranean beast. As my boots crunched over leaves and twigs, I felt as though I were being watched, not by the curious gaze of deer or the fleeting glance of an owl, but by something far more sinister. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. Every sound, every rustle in the underbrush, sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through me. Yet, despite the overwhelming urge to turn back, to abandon this insane mission, I pressed on. My sister needed me, and if there was any chance of finding her, I had to be brave. The first sign that I had crossed into something otherworldly came when I stumbled upon a clearing. It wasn't the natural kind of clearing one might expect in a forest. The ground was bare, devoid of grass or any vegetation. Strange symbols carved deep into the soil, spread out in intricate patterns that I couldn't begin to decipher. They glowed faintly, pulsating in a rhythm that seemed to match the beat of my own heart. In the center of the clearing lay a single withered tree, its bark blackened as though it had been struck by lightning countless times. Something about that tree filled me with a primal sense of fear, the kind that bypasses logic and settles deep in the marrow of your bones. Against my better judgment, I approached it. The air grew colder with each step, and an unnatural silence enveloped the clearing, muting even the sound of my own breathing. I could feel it, the tree, or perhaps something within it, was aware of my presence, and then I saw it. A faint glimmer caught my eye near the base of the tree. It was my sister's bracelet, unmistakable with its delicate beads and small charm. My stomach churned. She had been here. But where was she now? As I reached down to pick up the bracelet, the ground beneath me shuddered violently, as though the earth itself were awakening from a deep slumber. The symbols carved into the soil flared with an intense light, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the clearing. It wasn't the sound of an animal or any living thing I knew. It was ancient guttural, resonating with a frequency that seemed to rattle my very soul. I froze, my fingers just inches from the bracelet, as the withered tree began to groan. Its branches creaked and twisted, forming shapes that were almost humanoid but grotesquely distorted. A face emerged in the bark, its hollow eyes burning with an unholy light, its mouth a gaping void that seemed to swallow the dim light of the clearing. I stumbled back, clutching the bracelet to my chest, as the tree, no, the demon, began to move. Run, the thought screamed through my mind, louder than the pounding of my heart. I turned on my heel and bolted back into the forest, the light of my flashlight trembling as my hands shook. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, roots rising like the limbs of some massive predator, trying to ensnare me. The guttural sound from the clearing grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of something massive tearing through the forest behind me. I dared not look back, afraid of what I might see. My only focus was to keep moving, to put as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. But the forest itself seemed to conspire against me. Paths that I had taken mere minutes ago were gone, replaced by walls of trees. The air grew colder still, and the faint, eerie glow of the symbols began to appear on the trunks around me, as though the forest were marking me for the demon that pursued. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes, hours. Time had lost all meaning in this nightmarish maze. But eventually my legs gave out, and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. The sounds of pursuit had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that was almost worse. My flashlight flickered, its beam growing weaker by the second. As I sat there, trying to gather my thoughts, I became aware of a new sensation, a presence. It wasn't the demon from the clearing. This was different, more subtle, but no less terrifying. Slowly, I turned my head, and there, just at the edge of the faltering light, I saw them, eyes, countless eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, watching me from the shadows. They didn't move, didn't blink. They simply watched, their gazes filled with an almost palpable hunger. Panic surged through me once more, and I scrambled to my feet, only to realize that I was surrounded. The eyes were everywhere, encircling me in an unbroken wall of darkness. And then, as though in response to some unheard signal, they began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they closed in, their forms still obscured by the shadows. My flashlight gave one final flicker before dying completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. I felt a cold, clammy hand brush against my arm, and I screamed. But the sound barely escaped my lips before something sharp and jagged clamped over my mouth, muffling my cries. I was being pulled, dragged into the shadows by countless hands, their grip cold and unyielding. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me completely was the faint glow of the symbols, now etched into my own skin, pulsating with an eerie light. When I awoke, I was no longer in the forest. I was in a place that defied description, a realm where the laws of nature held no sway. The sky was a swirling mass of colors that I couldn't name, and the ground was a mirror-like surface that reflected nothing. The air was filled with whispers, unintelligible but undeniably malicious. And then I saw her, my sister, standing in the distance, her back to me. Relief flooded through me, and I called out to her, but she didn't respond. As I approached, I realized with growing horror that something was wrong. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as though she were a puppet on invisible strings. When she finally turned to face me, I saw that her eyes were glowing with the same unholy light as the demon from the clearing. She smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was something else, something that didn't belong to her. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice distorted, layered with tones that weren't her own. And then, before I could react, the ground beneath us shattered, and we were both plunged into the abyss. I don't know how long I've been here, in this place that exists beyond the boundaries of reality. Time has no meaning, and every moment is filled with the whispers of things that should not be. The symbols on my skin burn with a fire that never fades, a constant reminder of the pact I unwittingly made the moment I stepped into that clearing. I write this now, not in the hope of being saved, but as a warning. The forest is not what it seems. It is a gateway, a threshold to a place that no human should ever tread. If you find yourself drawn to its depths, turn back, for once you cross into its domain, there is no escape. And though I may be trapped here forever, a part of me knows that my story is not yet over. The forest has claimed me, but it has also made me a part of its eternal game. And one day, when the time is right, it will send me back to lure another unsuspecting soul into its grasp. Perhaps that soul will be yours. I awoke to a profound stillness, my eyes fluttering open to a void where light seemed absent, and the concept of up and down held no meaning. The ground beneath me was cold, a slick surface that felt alive as if it pulsed faintly with an eerie rhythm. Around me stretched an unending expanse of darkness, interspersed with glimmers of pale light that danced in and out of vision, teasing my senses. For a moment, I thought I had gone blind, but then the glowing symbols on my skin, the ones etched into me like a curse, flared up, illuminating the abyss in a dim, ghostly glow. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone. Figures moved in the distance, their forms indistinct and shrouded in shadow. They seemed to glide rather than walk, their movements unervingly smooth and deliberate. I couldn't tell whether they were human or something else entirely, but the sense of being watched, of being studied, was undeniable. I forced myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me. and try to get my bearings. The air here was oppressive, thick with a heaviness that made each breath a laborious effort. There was no sky, no horizon, just the endless black, punctuated by those distant, haunting lights. My instinct screamed at me to flee, but where could I go? This place defied logic, its geography an ever-shifting nightmare. As I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, a voice broke through the silence. It was soft, almost melodic, yet laced with an undercurrent of malice that sent shivers down my spine. "You shouldn't have come," it said, the words echoing as if spoken by 1,000 voices at once. I spun around, my heart pounding, but I saw no one. The voice continued, closer now. "You brought the mark upon yourself. Now you belong to the forest, to us." Panic surged within me as I clutched at the glowing symbols on my arms, as if I could somehow erase them. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice trembling, but the only response was a chilling laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then she appeared, my sister, or at least something wearing her form. She stepped out of the darkness, her movements eerily fluid, her eyes glowing with that same unholy light. Her face was a mask of sorrow and malice, a grotesque blend that made my stomach churn. "You should have left me," she said, her voice not her own, but a twisted mimicry. "Now you've doomed us both." She raised her hand, and the air between us shimmered, distorting like heat waves. In an instant, the ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling again, plunging into an abyss that seemed endless. When I hit the ground, the impact knocked the breath from my lungs, and I lay there gasping, disoriented. This new place was different. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by a dense, suffocating fog that clung to me like a second skin. The terrain was uneven, with jagged rocks jutting out at odd angles, and the air was filled with a low, droning hum that set my teeth on edge. I struggled to my feet, the symbols on my skin now burning with a searing intensity that made it difficult to think. It was as if they were reacting to something nearby, something that radiated a malevolent power. And then I saw it. Emerging from a fog was a figure unlike anything I had ever seen. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form humanoid but stretched and distorted in ways that defied nature. Its limbs were long and sinewy, ending in claw-like fingers that seemed to drip with darkness itself. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a blank void, yet I could feel its gaze boring into me, scrutinizing me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It spoke without a mouth, its voice reverberating through the fog, a deep and resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. "You are marked," it said, each word a hammer blow to my psyche. "You belong to the forest now. There is no escape." I tried to speak, to protest, but the words caught in my throat. The creature raised one elongated arm and gestured, and the fog around me began to swirl, forming shapes, faces, hands, twisted figures that reached out for me with desperate, grasping motions. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, but there was nowhere to go. The fog closed in around me, the figures becoming more solid, more real, until I was completely surrounded. They clawed at me, their touch icy and insubstantial, yet somehow they held me in place, immobilizing me. I screamed, the sound lost in the cacophony of their whispers and cries. The creature stepped closer, its towering form casting a shadow even in the fog. "You will serve," it said, and with a wave of its clawed hand, the symbols on my skin flared brighter than ever, the pain overwhelming. My vision blurred, and I felt myself falling once more, not into darkness, but into a blinding, all-consuming light. When I came to, I was back in the forest. Or at least, it seemed like the forest. The trees were familiar, yet different, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes that seemed to reach for me. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath me was soft and spongy, as though it were alive. I staggered to my feet, disoriented, and looked around. There was no sign of the clearing, no sign of the demon or the creature from the fog, but the symbols on my skin remained, a constant reminder of what I had endured. As I took a tentative step forward, I realized with growing horror that the forest was alive. The trees seemed to move when I wasn't looking, their branches shifting ever so slightly. The ground beneath me pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, and the air was filled with faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I wasn't alone. I could feel them watching, the unseen eyes that had haunted me since I first entered this nightmare. They were waiting for me to make a mistake. I don't know how long I wandered through that accursed forest, the days blending into nights in a seamless, unending cycle. Time had lost all meaning, and my mind was fraying at the edges, worn down by the constant fear and the ever-present sense of being hunted. I tried to find a way out, to retrace my steps back to the edge of the forest, but every path led me deeper, pulling me further into its labyrinthine heart. The forest wouldn't let me go. It had claimed me, just as it had claimed my sister, and yet a small, stubborn part of me refused to give up. I couldn't let it win. I had to find a way to break free, to end this nightmare once and for all. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no escape. The forest was a prison, its boundaries defined not by geography, but by the will of the ancient, malevolent force that ruled it. And I was its latest prisoner, marked and bound to its eternal game. As I sit here now, writing these words with trembling hands, I can hear them coming. The whispers are growing louder, the shadows closing in. I don't know how much longer I have, but I will keep fighting, keep searching for a way out, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the forest never gives up its prey willingly, and neither will I.